I buried my wife and my 7-year-old son in the freezing Chicago rain without a single member of my family standing beside me. 3 days later, a terrified lawyer slid a tablet across a diner table and played her final audio recording. Her voice was shaking as she said I needed to know who really caused the crash. Before the sun came up the next morning, my parents and my golden child brother were standing on my front porch, stripped of their millions, crying and begging me for mercy. My name is Nate Preston, and this is the story of how the worst day of my life unlocked a secret that burned a corrupt empire to the ground. The rain felt like shattered glass hitting my black suit. It was one of those bitter, unforgiving Chicago afternoons where the cold sinks straight into your bones and refuses to leave. I stood alone under a dark green canvas tent, staring at 2 mahogany caskets resting over open earth. One was standard size, the other was unbearably small. My wife Sarah and my son Leo. Gone. Wiped from the face of the earth in a single violent collision on Interstate 94 just 5 days ago. The police called it a tragic accident. A commercial truck lost its brakes and swerved into their lane. That was all it took to erase my entire world. The cemetery was located in Oak Brook, one of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had insisted on this specific location when I first called them with the news. My father had coldly stated over the phone that the Preston family name required a certain standard of dignity in all public matters, even in death. Yet as I looked at the front row of velvet folding chairs set up under the canvas, I saw absolutely no one. The seats reserved for my mother, my father, and my older brother Trent were empty. The rain continued to pound against the canvas roof, a loud and rhythmic drumming that filled the heavy silence. A few of my co-workers from the insurance firm stood near the back holding black umbrellas, shifting uncomfortably. They were casting sympathetic glances not just at the caskets but at the empty front row. They knew I was entirely alone. Father Thomas, the elderly priest who had married Sarah and me 10 years ago, stood beside the graves. He pulled his coat tighter around his neck and gave me a gentle, pitying look. He leaned in quietly so the few attendees would not hear. He asked me if we should wait a little longer for my family to arrive. He knew they were wealthy, prominent figures in the local real estate community. He assumed they were simply caught in the terrible city traffic. I told him to give me 1 minute. I reached into my soaked coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I thought maybe my mother had sent a text, or perhaps my father had his assistant call to say they were navigating the flooded roads. Instead, my screen lit up with a notification from a social media app. It was an alert that my brother Trent had just made a new post. My thumb hovered over the screen, my chest tightening with a sudden suffocating dread. I tapped the notification. The screen loaded a crisp, high-definition photograph uploaded exactly 10 minutes ago. It was not a picture of a traffic jam. It was a picture of Trent standing in the grand marble lobby of his newest luxury condominium project downtown. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, holding a giant pair of ceremonial novelty scissors. He was cutting a wide red ribbon with a massive, arrogant smile on his face. Standing immediately to his right was my father Richard, holding a glass of champagne and beaming with absolute pride. Standing to his left was my mother Patricia, wearing a designer dress and clapping enthusiastically. The caption beneath the photo read, "A historic day for Preston Development. The $50 million Horizon Tower is officially open for business. Thank you to my incredible parents for their unwavering support. Cheers to the future." I stood in the freezing rain staring at a picture of my family celebrating with champagne while my wife and child lay in wooden boxes 6 feet away from me. My hands began to shake, not from the cold, but from a rage so deep and primal it felt like my ribs were going to crack open. The contrast was physically nauseating. The warm, golden lighting of Trent's luxury lobby against the gray, muddy reality of the cemetery. The smiles on their faces while I was trying to figure out how to keep breathing without my son. I locked my phone, slid it back into my pocket, and looked up at Father Thomas. I kept my voice completely flat, completely devoid of the agony tearing me apart inside. I told him they were not coming and that he could begin the service. As he opened his Bible and started reading the customary prayers, I did not hear a single word. My mind was entirely consumed by the brutal, undeniable truth of my family dynamic. I was always the disappointment. In the Preston family, you were either a shark or you were bait. My father had spent 40 years building a ruthless reputation in corporate acquisitions, and he demanded his sons reflect his aggressive appetite for wealth. Trent was exactly what my father wanted. Trent was loud, charismatic, and perfectly willing to step on anyone's throat to close a real estate deal. By the time Trent was 30, he was already driving luxury sports cars and dating models. My father treated him like a king. I was the opposite. I am a corporate actuary. My entire career is built on assessing risk, analyzing data, and finding quiet, stable truths in a world of chaos. I never wanted the spotlight. I never wanted the country club memberships or the aggressive boardroom shouting matches. I wanted a quiet life, a steady paycheck, and a home filled with love. When I introduced Sarah to my parents, they immediately judged her. Sarah was a forensic accountant. She was brilliant, sharp, and came from a working-class neighborhood in the city. She saw right through their pretension and refused to kiss the ring. My father called her pedestrian. My mother constantly asked when I was going to upgrade my career so I could afford a lifestyle worthy of the Preston name. They hated that I was happy with what I had. They hated that I drove a practical sedan, lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, and spent my weekends building Lego sets with Leo instead of golfing with venture capitalists. Over the years, the invitations to family holidays became scarce. The phone calls stopped. I was slowly and deliberately erased from their lives because my lack of flashy ambition was an embarrassment to their brand. But I never cared because I had Sarah. She was my anchor. She was the one who told me that a man's worth is measured by how he treats his family, not by the balance of his investment portfolio. She made me feel like I was enough. And Leo, with his bright eyes and endless questions about how the world worked, gave my life a purpose that money could never buy. And now they were gone, stolen from me in a mess of crushed metal and shattered glass. And the people who shared my blood, the people who were supposed to hold me up when the world collapsed, had chosen a public relations event over the burial of their own grandson. The service ended. The few co-workers offered their hurried condolences, patting my shoulder before rushing back to their warm cars. I stood by the graves until the cemetery workers began lowering the caskets into the earth. I watched the mud cover the polished wood. I felt completely hollowed out, as if my soul had been scooped out of my chest and buried right alongside them. There were no tears left. I had cried until my vision blurred over the past 5 days. Now there was only a cold, terrifying emptiness. I walked back to my car, my clothes soaked through to my skin. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, shivering uncontrollably. The silence inside the car was deafening. Usually, when I drove home from work, I would call Sarah on the Bluetooth to ask if she needed anything from the grocery store. I would hear Leo in the background talking about his day at school. Today, there was just the sound of the rain hitting the windshield. I turned the key in the ignition and drove away from the cemetery, leaving my entire heart behind in the wet dirt. The drive back to my house took 45 minutes. Every street corner, every stoplight, every familiar landmark felt like a physical blow. I passed the park where I taught Leo how to ride a bicycle. I passed the bakery where Sarah and I bought fresh bread every Sunday morning. The world was moving forward, completely indifferent to the fact that my universe had just ended. I pulled into my driveway. The house looked dark and lifeless. The front lawn was overgrown because I had not mowed it since the accident. I turned off the engine and just sat there, dreading the moment I had to walk through the front door. The thought of stepping into a house filled with Sarah's clothes, Leo's toys, and the lingering scent of their lives was paralyzing. But I knew I could not sit in the cold car forever. I forced myself to open the door and step out into the rain. I walked heavily up the concrete path to the small wooden porch. My head was down, my mind replaying the image of Trent cutting that red ribbon with a victorious smile. I reached into my pocket for my house keys, my fingers stiff and numb from the cold. As I stepped up onto the porch, I finally looked up at the front door. Taped directly to the center of the wood at eye level was a bright yellow piece of legal paper. It was wrapped in a clear plastic sleeve to protect it from the rain, standing out like a warning sign against the dark paint of the door. My brow furrowed in confusion. I had paid all my utility bills. I was current on my mortgage. I stepped closer, my heart rate slowly beginning to climb. I pulled the tape off the wood and held the document in my trembling hands. The bold black letters at the top of the page seemed to blur together before coming into sharp, horrifying focus. It was a formal legal decree from a major national bank. The heading read, "Notice of Default and Intent to Foreclose." I blinked, trying to clear the rainwater from my eyes, sure that it was a mistake. I read the text beneath the heading. It stated that the property was currently in default due to a failure to meet the obligations of a collateralized debt agreement. It claimed that the mortgage had been leveraged against a commercial mezzanine loan and that the principal sum of $2.5 million had gone unpaid for 90 days. The document stated that the bank was seizing the property and that I had exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises before law enforcement would forcefully remove my belongings. My breath caught in my throat. I read the document a second time, then a third. The address on the paper was correct. My name was printed clearly as the primary guarantor, but I had never taken out a commercial loan. I had never leveraged my home. I lived entirely within my means specifically because my job as an actuary taught me the catastrophic dangers of over-leveraging debt. Then my eyes drifted down to the bottom of the page to the section detailing the primary beneficiary of the $2.5 million loan. It was listed as Apex Horizon Development, Trent's corporate entity, the exact same company that had just opened the $50 million luxury condominium tower downtown. The same tower he was cutting the ribbon for while I was burying my family. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. Trent had not just abandoned me at the cemetery. He had used my name. He had forged my signature to secure risky bridge capital for his development, using the only thing I owned as collateral to fund his luxury empire. He had gambled my home to build his tower, knowing that if his funding fell through the bank, would come from my house, not his. I stood on the porch holding the foreclosure notice, the rain dripping from my hair onto the yellow paper. My wife and son were dead. My family had celebrated while they were lowered into the ground, and now my brother had secretly stolen the roof over my head. The cold emptiness in my chest suddenly vanished. It was instantly replaced by a burning, violent surge of adrenaline. The nightmare was not over. It was just beginning, and I was going to make sure that the people who caused it would regret the day they decided I was nothing but collateral damage. I stood on my wooden front porch with the freezing Chicago rain soaking completely through the shoulders of my dark suit. The water dripped from my hair onto the bright yellow legal document I had just peeled off my front door. In my daily life as a corporate actuary, I spent countless hours dissecting risk liability and impenetrable financial jargon. Reading complex contracts was second nature to me. My brain automatically stripped away the confusing legal terminology to expose the naked, brutal mathematics hidden underneath. This was a formal notice of default, but it was not for a missed mortgage payment on my end. I had always paid my bills on time. I wiped the rain from my eyes and read the fine print in the second paragraph, which detailed a secondary lien. The legal wording specified a commercial mezzanine bridge loan. The principal amount listed was $2.5 million. I knew exactly what that meant. It was a high-risk, high-interest loan designed to inject fast capital into a commercial construction project that was rapidly bleeding cash. The primary debtor listed on the paperwork was Apex Horizon Development. That was Trent's flagship corporate entity. It was the very same company that owned the gleaming $50 million luxury tower he had just opened while I was standing alone over my family's graves. My breathing turned shallow and rapid. I scanned down the page to the guarantor section. A mezzanine loan of that massive size required substantial collateral to mitigate the lender's financial risk. Trent had not used his own penthouse or his investment portfolios. He had used my property. Printed clearly on the bottom line was my full legal name, Nathaniel Preston, listed as the unconditional guarantor. I stared in absolute shock at the signature line. It was my name written in a messy scrawl that vaguely resembled my handwriting, but lacked the sharp, precise angles I always used on my letters. Someone had forged my signature. Trent had falsified official financial documents to leverage my home. It was the only piece of property I actually owned free and clear, and he used it to secure emergency funding for his luxury condominium project. He had taken out a massive loan against my house, knowing exactly what would happen if his cash flow stalled. The commercial bank would not come for his luxury sports cars. They would come for the modest roof over my head. A cold sweat broke out across my neck, mixing with the icy rain. My brilliant wife and my sweet 7-year-old son had just been lowered into the wet earth. My family had skipped their funeral to drink champagne at a ribbon-cutting ceremony. And all the while my older brother had been secretly waiting for the bank to throw me out onto the street. The crushing grief that had paralyzed me moments ago evaporated into the cold air. It was instantly replaced by a violent, blinding fury. I crumpled the yellow foreclosure notice in my fist, turned around, and marched right back to my car. The tires of my practical sedan screeched against the wet pavement as I backed out of my driveway. I did not care about the local speed limits. I did not care about the red lights reflecting off the slick city streets. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Chicago, heading directly for the Preston Development corporate headquarters. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a bruised, painful shade of white. The heater was blasting inside the car, but I was shivering from pure, unfiltered rage. I pulled up to the towering glass and steel monolith that housed my father's empire. I left my car parked diagonally across 2 reserved executive spaces right near the main entrance. I marched through the revolving glass doors, tracking mud and rainwater across the pristine white marble lobby. The receptionist behind the sprawling mahogany desk stood up and called out my name in a panic. She told me I could not go upstairs without an official appointment. I completely ignored her. I swiped my old family access card at the security turnstile, pushed through the metal gates, and shoved my way into the executive elevator. I hit the button for the 50th floor. The ride up felt like it took an absolute eternity. The elevator speakers played a soft, cheerful jazz melody that clashed violently with the roaring sound of my own heartbeat. When the polished steel doors finally slid open, I stepped out into the opulent penthouse suite of Preston Development. The air up here smelled of expensive cologne wealth and freshly brewed espresso. I walked straight past the executive assistants who rushed out from behind their desks to block my path. I reached the heavy, solid oak double doors of the main boardroom and shoved them open with both hands. They slammed against the interior walls with a thunderous crash. The room went dead silent. A dozen men in sharp, tailored suits turned to look at me in shock. Sitting at the far end of the massive glass table was Trent. He was laughing at something the man next to him had just said, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. At the head of the table sat my father Richard. He looked up from his leather portfolio, his face immediately twisting into a mask of pure disgust. I walked forward, my wet shoes squeaking against the hardwood floor. I threw the crumpled yellow foreclosure notice directly onto the polished glass table. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of Trent's folded hands. I did not yell. My voice was dangerously quiet, dropping to a tone I had never used before in my entire life. I looked Trent dead in the eye and asked him how much he thought my life was worth. I asked him if $2.5 million was the going rate for a brother's soul. I asked him if forging my signature on federal bank documents was a difficult task, or if fraud just came naturally to a coward. Trent leaned back in his plush leather chair, completely unbothered by my presence. He straightened his expensive silk tie, glanced at the crumpled paper, and let out a short, patronizing sigh. He told me to lower my voice because there were important investors in the room. He did not deny the forgery. He did not even attempt to construct a lie. He simply looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience that had wandered in from the rain. My father stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly around the enormous table toward me. There was no sympathy in his dark eyes. There was no trace of a grieving grandfather who had just lost his only grandson. He stopped 2 feet away from me, looking me up and down with intense judgment. He took in my soaked, cheap suit, my muddy shoes, and my pale, exhausted face. He told me to stop being hysterical. He said I was embarrassing myself and tarnishing the prestige of the family name in front of his partners. I stared at him in absolute disbelief. I asked him if he had heard a single word I just said. I told him Trent forged my signature and put my house in foreclosure. I told him I had just buried Sarah and Leo by myself in the mud while they were drinking champagne downtown. Richard did not flinch. His expression remained as cold and hard as the marble in his lobby. He placed his hands casually in his pockets and told me that business requires capital. He explained that Trent's downtown project had hit a temporary liquidity snag, and they needed a clean asset to secure the bridge loan to finish the tower. He said my house was doing nothing but sitting there in the suburbs generating zero revenue. He actually looked me in the eyes and told me that family requires sacrifice and that I should be proud to help my older brother secure the future of the Preston legacy. I felt the blood rushing to my face. I took a step closer to my father and told him he was a monster. I told him that Sarah was right about him all along, that he possessed no soul and cared only for his bank accounts. The mention of my wife's name made Richard sneer. He leaned in close to me, his breath smelling heavily of expensive scotch. He told me Sarah was a pedestrian distraction who kept me wallowing in a life of mediocrity. He told me I was a parasite draining the emotional resources of the family without ever contributing to its financial greatness. He looked at me with pure venom and told me to get out of his building and go mourn somewhere cheap. I lost all control. The civilized, calculating corporate actuary vanished completely. I lunged forward and grabbed the lapels of my father's custom suit, shoving him backward against the edge of the glass table. Several of the wealthy investors shouted in alarm, dropping their pens. Trent jumped up from his chair and yelled for corporate security. Before I could even process what was happening, 2 massive security guards burst into the boardroom from the side entrance. They grabbed my arms, twisting them painfully and aggressively behind my back. I struggled, fighting with everything I had left in me, but I was exhausted, grieving, and starving. I had not slept or eaten properly in 5 entire days. The guards easily overpowered my resistance. They dragged me backward out of the boardroom. As the heavy wooden doors swung shut, I saw Trent picking up the yellow foreclosure notice and tossing it casually into the sleek metal trash can. The guards marched me aggressively down the long hallway, shoved me into the service elevator, and rode it all the way down to the underground parking garage. When the metal doors opened, they pushed me violently out into the concrete corridor. I lost my balance, tripping over my own wet shoes, and crashed hard onto the rough pavement. My shoulder slammed into the concrete, and a sharp, agonizing pain shot through my ribs. I gasped for air, clutching my side. The taller guard pointed a thick finger at my face. He warned me that if I stepped foot on Preston property ever again, they would have the police arrest me for trespassing and physical assault. They walked back into the service elevator, leaving me lying on the cold, dirty floor of the garage. It took me a full minute to catch my breath. I pushed myself up from the ground, wincing as the pain radiated from my bruised ribs through my chest. I stumbled through the dimly lit garage until I found the exit ramp, and I walked back out into the pouring rain to find my car parked on the street. I sat heavily in the driver's seat, clutching my chest and shivering. I was entirely alone in the world. My family had not just abandoned me in my darkest hour, they had actively plotted to destroy me. I needed to fight back. I needed to hire a ruthless lawyer to prove the signature on that commercial mezzanine loan was a blatant forgery. I reached into my wet pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my mobile banking application. I knew I had about $40,000 sitting in my personal savings account. It was the money Sarah and I had been meticulously saving for Leo's future college fund. It would be more than enough to retain a highly skilled defense attorney. The application loaded with a bright blue screen. I typed in my password with shaking thumbs and pressed enter. The screen flashed a bright red warning banner across the top. It stated that the account was currently locked due to a pending legal garnishment from a commercial creditor. My available balance read $0.00. I stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the terrible numbers. The commercial bank holding the fraudulent mezzanine loan had already initiated a total freeze on my liquid assets to cover the default penalties. Trent and my father had fully anticipated my reaction. They had moved with ruthless, calculated efficiency to strip me of any financial resources I could possibly use to defend myself in court. They had cut off my air supply before I even knew I was suffocating. I hit the refresh button on the screen, desperately hoping it was a technical network glitch. The red banner remained. $0. I was completely broke. As I sat there staring at the empty bank account, my phone suddenly vibrated in my palm. The incoming caller ID displayed the name of my boss at the insurance firm. His name was David, and we had always maintained a very solid, respectful professional relationship. I answered the call immediately, hoping for a brief moment of normalcy, or perhaps a kind word of condolence regarding the funeral today. Instead, David's voice was incredibly tense and uncomfortably formal. He did not offer any sympathy for my wife or my son. He immediately told me that the Human Resources Department had processed my termination, effective immediately. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. I asked him what he was talking about, reminding him that my performance reviews were absolutely flawless and my analytical models saved the firm millions last quarter. David paused for a long moment before explaining the reality of the situation. He told me that he had just received a direct phone call from my father. Richard Preston was not just a powerful real estate mogul, he was also one of the largest institutional shareholders in our insurance firm. My father had personally instructed the chief executive officer to fire me. Richard claimed that the overwhelming grief over losing my family had caused me to suffer a violent, dangerous, psychotic break. He told my boss that I had just physically assaulted him in a boardroom and that I was a massive legal liability to the company. David told me that my corporate access badges were permanently revoked and my final severance paycheck would be mailed to my address. Before I could even open my mouth to defend myself, the line went completely dead. The digital dial tone echoed in the quiet, cold interior of my car. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. In the span of a single afternoon, I had buried my entire family, discovered my older brother forged my signature, lost my home, been physically thrown out onto the street, had my entire life savings frozen by a bank, and been fired from my career. My father and my brother had systematically dismantled my entire existence to protect a real estate deal. They had reduced me to absolutely nothing. I leaned my head back against the damp headrest and closed my eyes, letting the darkness take over my mind. I had no money. I had no job. I had no home to return to. Then my phone vibrated one more time in my lap. It was not a phone call. It was a text message from an unknown number. I opened my eyes and looked at the glowing screen in the dim gray light of the car. The message was brief, urgent, and terrifying. It read, "Nate, it is Harrison Cole. I am Sarah's lawyer. We need to meet right now. Do not go back to your house." The rain had turned into a torrential downpour by the time I reached the outskirts of the city. My tires hydroplaned slightly on the slick asphalt as I navigated away from the gleaming high rises of downtown Chicago and into a forgotten industrial sector. The text message on my burner screen burned a hole in my mind. Harrison Cole. Sarah had mentioned that name exactly twice in our entire marriage. I knew him only as a senior partner at a boutique corporate law firm she occasionally consulted for complex audits. He was not the kind of man who sent cryptic emergency texts in the middle of the night. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a 24-hour diner. It was a bleak concrete box glowing with flickering neon tubes surrounded by abandoned warehouses. It was the absolute last place you would expect to find a high-powered Chicago attorney. I killed the engine and sat in the dark car for a long moment. My ribs throbbed with a dull and heavy ache from where Trent's security guards had thrown me onto the parking garage floor. My bank accounts were completely frozen. My career was gone. My wife and son were resting in fresh graves. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I pushed open the car door and stepped out into the freezing deluge. The bell above the diner door jingled weakly as I walked inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach. There were only 3 other people in the entire restaurant: a tired waitress wiping down a counter, a truck driver asleep in a back booth, and a man sitting in the darkest corner facing the entrance. I recognized Harrison Cole immediately, but he looked absolutely nothing like the polished, confident lawyer I'd met at a corporate holiday party 3 years ago. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained. His tie was missing. His gray hair was disheveled, and he was constantly checking the rain-streaked window next to his table. His hands were shaking so violently that the coffee in his ceramic mug was spilling over the rim onto the laminate tabletop. I walked over and slid into the vinyl booth across from him. He jumped slightly at the sound of my movement, clutching the edge of the table as if preparing to run. When he realized it was me, he let out a ragged breath and slumped back against the booth. He looked at my soaked clothes and the bruising already forming along my jawline. He swallowed hard and asked me if I had been followed. I told him I had just been thrown out of my father's corporate headquarters and fired from my job. I told him I did not think they needed to follow me because they had already destroyed me. Harrison shook his head frantically. He leaned across the table, his voice barely above a frantic whisper. He told me I had absolutely no idea how deep this went. He said losing my job and my house was just the beginning. I demanded to know what he was talking about. I asked him why the lawyer of a forensic accountant was hiding in a rundown diner looking like a hunted animal. Harrison took a napkin and wiped the spilled coffee from his hands. He looked me dead in the eyes and delivered a truth that completely rewrote the last 2 years of my marriage. He told me that Sarah was not just conducting routine tax audits for her accounting firm. For the past 14 months, she had been running a highly classified independent investigation into Preston Development. She had come to Harrison because she needed attorney-client privilege to shield her findings. She was legally forbidden from telling me what she was doing. She knew that if my father or my brother even suspected she was looking into their books, my life would be in immediate danger. She was trying to protect me by keeping me completely in the dark. I sat there stunned. My brilliant, beautiful wife had been sitting across from me at the dinner table every night, smiling and asking about my day while secretly dismantling my family's corporate empire. I asked Harrison what exactly she had found. I told him my father and brother were ruthless businessmen, but they were not criminal masterminds. They built luxury condominiums. They played golf. They hosted charity galas. Harrison let out a bitter, hollow laugh. He told me that the luxury condominiums were nothing but a smokescreen. He leaned closer until I could smell the stale fear and black coffee on his breath. He explained that Trent's entire real estate empire was an elaborate, massive Ponzi scheme. Preston Development had not turned a legitimate profit in over 7 years. Harrison began to detail the staggering scope of the fraud. He told me that Trent was using highly leveraged commercial mezzanine debt to fund the construction of new properties. But instead of using the revenue from those properties to pay off the loans, he was creating dozens of anonymous shell companies offshore. He would use the newly borrowed money to pay the interest on the old loans, creating a massive, unstable house of cards. The $50 million Horizon Tower that Trent had just opened today was entirely funded by fraudulent capital. They were shuffling invisible money across international borders to create the illusion of infinite wealth. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The $2.5 million loan attached to my house suddenly made terrifying sense. Trent was so desperate for clean collateral to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat that he was willing to forge his own brother's signature and risk leaving me homeless. But Harrison was not finished. He told me that Trent was just the architect of the financial shell game. My father, Richard, was the enforcer who kept the entire operation hidden from federal regulators. Richard used his elite country club memberships and philanthropic foundations to launder the stolen money. He was systematically bribing city zoning commissioners, state building inspectors, and local politicians. Anyone who threatened to look too closely at the Preston Development financial records suddenly received a massive anonymous donation to their re-election campaign or a lucrative consulting contract for their spouses. Harrison said Sarah had tracked every single dollar. She had built a comprehensive master ledger that connected my father's country club bribes directly to Trent's fraudulent shell companies. She had physical proof of wire transfers, forged signatures, and illegal payouts. She had uncovered a criminal conspiracy so massive that it would not just put my father and brother in federal prison for the rest of their lives. It would take down half the political establishment in Chicago. The weight of the revelation pressed down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. My entire life of feeling inadequate, of feeling like the disappointment of the Preston family, was built on a lie. They did not despise me because I lacked ambition. They despised me because my quiet, honest life was a direct threat to their corruption. I was the only variable they could not control. I asked Harrison where the evidence was. I told him we needed to take everything directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation tonight. I told him we could end this right now and clear my name. Harrison looked down at his shaking hands. He told me it was not that simple. He reached into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a silver iPad. He slid the device across the sticky laminate table until it rested right in front of me. He said he did not have the evidence. He only had the final message Sarah left behind. My heart hammered violently against my bruised ribs. I stared at the blank screen of the tablet. The mere thought of seeing Sarah's face or hearing her voice felt like stepping barefoot onto shattered glass. It had only been 5 days since the highway patrol officer knocked on my front door. The wounds were still bleeding. Harrison gently tapped the screen, entering a passcode. A video file opened. He pressed play and pushed the tablet closer to me. The screen flickered to life. There was Sarah. She was sitting in the front seat of her car. The morning sunlight was streaming through her windshield, highlighting the golden strands of her hair. She was wearing the exact same green trench coat she had put on the morning she died. Seeing her alive, breathing, and moving on the screen sent a shockwave of absolute agony through my entire body. I wanted to reach through the digital glass and pull her out. I wanted to scream at her to stay home that day, but her face was not relaxed. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her beautiful eyes, and she was constantly glancing at her rearview mirror. When she looked back into the camera, her expression was filled with a fierce, desperate determination. Her voice played through the small speakers of the tablet. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking sound I had ever heard. "Nate," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If you are watching this, it means they found out what I know. It means the safety protocols I put in place have been triggered. I am so incredibly sorry for hiding this from you for so long. I only wanted to protect you and Leo from the monster your father truly is." She took a deep, shaky breath. I could see the terror hiding just behind her brave facade. She looked directly into the lens and delivered the words that would change my destiny forever. "Trent and Richard are running a massive criminal syndicate. I have every piece of documentation needed to put them away forever. But they know I am close. I think they have been following me. If something happens to me, they are going to come after you. They are going to try to ruin you financially, legally, and personally to keep you quiet. They will take your home and your job to make sure you have no resources to fight back. Do not let them win, Nate. I left you the weapon to destroy them. I hid the master ledger where they will never, ever think to look. You need to find it, and you need to burn their empire to the ground. I love you. Tell Leo that Mommy loves him more than anything in the world." The video abruptly cut to black. I sat perfectly still, staring at my own reflection in the dark screen of the tablet. The tears I thought I had completely exhausted were now streaming freely down my face. My wife had known they were coming for her. She had spent her final days living in absolute terror, desperately trying to build a case to stop my family from hurting anyone else, and my father had ordered a hit. He had ordered one of his defective logistics trucks to run her off the road. He murdered my wife and my beautiful 7-year-old son to protect his bank accounts. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The grief completely vanished, swallowed whole by a cold, calculated need for absolute destruction. I looked up at Harrison. I told him I needed to know exactly where she hid the ledger. I told him I did not care what it took. I was going to follow her instructions and burn my family to the ground. Harrison opened his mouth to speak. He raised a trembling finger pointing toward the digital screen. He told me that Sarah had set up a dead man's switch. Before the next syllable could leave his lips, a deafening explosion shattered the air. The massive plate glass window of the diner completely disintegrated inward. A shower of jagged razor-sharp glass rained down across the tables and the cracked linoleum floor. I threw my arms up to protect my face, diving sideways out of the booth as a heavy red brick slammed onto our table right where my head had been a fraction of a second before. The tired waitress screamed, dropping a pot of coffee that shattered upon impact. The truck driver in the back booth leaped to his feet, shouting in confusion. The cold Chicago wind and the freezing rain immediately howled through the gaping hole in the front of the restaurant, blowing napkins and sugar packets across the room in a chaotic storm. I scrambled on my hands and knees across the glass-covered floor, ignoring the sharp stings as fragments sliced into my palms. I looked up to see a dark figure sprinting away from the broken window, disappearing instantly into the rain-soaked shadows of the abandoned warehouse district. They had found us. I turned back to the booth. Harrison was screaming in absolute terror. He was not crawling for cover. He was scrambling frantically, grabbing the silver iPad from the table and shoving it into his leather briefcase. I yelled at him to stop, to get down on the floor before they came back. Harrison ignored me completely. His eyes were wide and completely wild with panic. He clutched his briefcase to his chest like a shield. He looked down at me, bleeding on the diner floor, and yelled over the sound of the howling wind. He told me they had already been to his law firm. He screamed that he arrived at his office 2 hours ago to find the door kicked in and every single filing cabinet completely gutted. "They know what she did," Harrison yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "They are erasing everything. I cannot help you, Nate. If I stay here, they are going to kill me too. You are completely on your own." I reached out desperately, trying to grab the sleeve of his wrinkled suit. I told him he could not leave me like this. I told him I needed to know where the ledger was hidden. But the lawyer was already moving. He kicked the back door of the diner open and bolted out into the dark alley, disappearing into the freezing downpour without looking back. I was left kneeling on the floor of a ruined diner, surrounded by shattered glass and spilled coffee. The cold rain blew through the broken windows, soaking my clothes and chilling me to the absolute bone. My father and my brother were actively hunting me down. They had unlimited money, unlimited power, and a private army of security and corrupt police at their disposal, and I had absolutely nothing. I pulled myself up from the debris, ignoring the blood dripping from my hands. Sarah had left me a weapon. She had left me a way to fight back. I did not know where it was hidden, and I did not know how to activate it. I was standing in the ruins of my life, armed with only half the truth. But as I walked out of that shattered diner into the freezing Chicago storm, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The corporate actuary who played it safe was dead and buried. My family wanted a war, and I was going to give them one. The freezing Chicago downpour felt like 1,000 tiny needles striking my face as I watched Harrison Cole disappear into the dark industrial shadows. I did not attempt to chase the terrified lawyer through the flooded streets. There was absolutely no point in running after a man consumed by panic. Harrison had fled like a hunted animal, but before his abrupt departure, he had inadvertently handed me the exact compass I desperately needed. My brilliant wife had not been killed by a random stroke of terrible luck on the highway. She had been actively dismantling my family's fraudulent corporate empire, and her death was intricately connected to her forensic discoveries. Or at least, that is what I initially assumed. I needed concrete data to separate paranoia from reality. I am a corporate actuary. My entire professional existence revolves around dismantling complex systems, analyzing hidden variables, and calculating the precise mathematical moment where catastrophic failure inevitably occurs. If my father and older brother were genuinely running a massive criminal syndicate, disguised as a luxury real estate development firm, they would have inevitably left a paper trail. You can easily bribe city zoning officials and physically intimidate opposing lawyers, but you cannot permanently erase the digital footprint of a commercial insurance liability claim. I walked nearly 3 miles through the unrelenting storm until I finally reached the massive stone pillars of the downtown public library. My dark funeral suit was completely ruined, heavy with rain and splattered with mud from the diner parking lot. The security guard stationed just inside the main entrance gave my battered, bruised appearance a highly suspicious glare, but he remained silent as I walked past his podium. I navigated through the labyrinth of tall, quiet bookshelves until I found a secluded public computer terminal tucked away in the deepest corner of the reference section. My hands were shivering so violently from the bitter cold that I could barely type my own login credentials on the worn plastic keyboard. When my former boss David fired me earlier that afternoon, he had immediately ordered human resources to revoke all my physical corporate access badges. However, in his desperate rush to appease my father, he had carelessly neglected to contact the state regulatory board to suspend my federal insurance underwriting portal access. That minor bureaucratic oversight was going to become the greatest unforced error of his entire career. I swiftly bypassed the standard public internet filters and tunneled my connection directly into the highly secure, centralized state insurance database. The glowing monitor cast a harsh, unnatural blue light over my bruised and exhausted face. I took a deep, shuddering breath, typed in the exact date of the crash, and entered the specific highway mile marker where my life had ended just 5 days ago. Up until this very moment, I had actively refused to read the official police report. I knew that I could never mentally bring myself to process the clinical, sterile details of how my wife and my 7-year-old son were violently taken from me. Now, sitting alone in the silent library, I violently forced my eyes to scan the cold black and white text scrolling across the screen. The responding highway patrol officer had officially ruled the horrific collision as a tragic, completely unavoidable vehicular accident. The official narrative stated that an overworked commercial freight driver had suffered a sudden catastrophic mechanical failure of his primary air brake system. The 30-ton commercial transport rig had completely lost all stopping power on a steep downhill slope, severely hydroplaned on the wet asphalt, and aggressively crossed the concrete median directly into Sarah's lane. Reading the mechanical, completely emotionless breakdown of my family's final agonizing moments made a hot, bitter wave of nausea rise in my throat. The report reduced my entire world to skid marks velocity estimates and blunt force trauma trajectories. But the highly trained analytical sector of my brain immediately flagged a massive, glaring discrepancy in the narrative. Commercial freight trucks do not simply lose their entire braking systems without a prolonged, heavily documented history of severe mechanical neglect. A modern air brake system is designed with multiple redundant fail-safes precisely to prevent a catastrophic blowout on a busy interstate. I immediately pulled the 17-digit vehicle identification number from the attached police file and ran it directly through the Federal Commercial Liability Registry. The archaic database churned for a few agonizing seconds, processing the query before spitting out the comprehensive underwriting profile. The killer truck belonged to a regional freight carrier registered under the name Apex Logistics. The corporate title sent a violent, electrifying shockwave directly through my chest. Apex Logistics was the exact same shell company Trent had listed as the primary beneficiary on the fraudulent commercial mezzanine loan that stole my house earlier today. My hands flew aggressively across the keyboard, pulling every single fleet maintenance record tax filing and inspection sheet filed under that specific corporate umbrella. I expected to find evidence of a calculated assassination, I expected to find proof that a hitman had intentionally run her off the road to silence her audit. What I actually found was something infinitely more insulting, sickening, and degrading. It was not a brilliant corporate conspiracy. It was raw, unchecked, pathetic greed. The logistics truck that crushed Sarah and Leo had catastrophically failed state highway safety inspections 5 separate times within the last 8 months. The digital maintenance logs showed that the brake lines were practically disintegrating from heavy rust. The hydraulic suspension system was completely shot, and the tires were operating far below the legal tread limits. By all measurable legal and ethical metrics, that specific vehicle should have been permanently impounded by the state and sold for scrap metal over half a year ago. But keeping a massive, lucrative commercial construction supply chain moving requires constant, uninterrupted freight transportation. Replacing a failing fleet of supply trucks would have cost Trent several $1 million in upfront capital. That kind of sudden, massive operational expenditure would have absolutely ruined the pristine financial prospectus for his highly anticipated $50 million corporate public offering. So my father Richard had quietly stepped in to solve the problem. I systematically cross-referenced the exact dates of the failed state inspections with the commercial insurance operational waivers granted to the company. Every single time the truck was flagged by a mechanic for critical life-threatening safety violations, an official signature from a senior regional transportation director miraculously appeared in the system 24 hours later. The signature systematically granted the dangerous vehicle a temporary operational waiver, allowing it to bypass the repair mandate and return immediately to the highway. I searched the transportation director's name in the local societal archives. He was a highly prominent active member of my father's exclusive, heavily gated country club. Richard had been systematically bribing state regulators to keep Trent's decaying, deadly logistics fleet on the road. They had aggressively gambled the lives of thousands of innocent civilian drivers just to artificially inflate their corporate valuation before the Wall Street bell rang. My beautiful wife had not been intentionally assassinated by a hired killer to silence her dangerous investigation. She was violently killed because my billionaire father simply refused to pay for new brake pads. Their blind arrogance and their disgusting obsession with profit margins had directly murdered their own daughter-in-law and their only grandson. They traded Leo's bright, beautiful future for a slightly higher quarterly earnings report. I sat completely frozen in the silent library, surrounded by dusty shelves of encyclopedias, entirely unable to draw breath. The sheer overwhelming banality of the evil was staggering. They did not even view Sarah and Leo as human beings. They were just acceptable collateral damage in the grand pursuit of expanding the Preston real estate empire. I slammed my finger onto the print command on the terminal keyboard. The ancient heavy laser printer sitting next to the reference desk loudly groaned to life, churning out 50 pages of damning, absolutely undeniable evidence. I grabbed the stack of warm paper tightly in my hands, feeling the physical weight of my family's stolen justice. It was the entire, undisputed paper trail. The failed mechanical inspections, the fraudulent regulatory waivers, the dark money insurance loopholes, and the direct ownership ties linking the killer truck right back to Trent's luxury condominium tower. I meticulously rolled the dense stack of documents into a tight, solid cylinder and shoved them deep inside the interior pocket of my wet jacket to protect them from the rain. I finally had the loaded ammunition I needed to tear their entire world apart. All I had to do now was figure out how to locate Sarah's hidden master ledger, and I could confidently deliver the fatal, crushing blow to their corrupt organization. I pushed aggressively through the heavy glass doors of the library and stepped back out into the harsh Chicago night. The torrential downpour had slightly slowed to a steady freezing drizzle. The tall yellow street lamps reflected brightly off the wet pavement, casting long, distorted shadows across the dark concrete. I pulled up the collar of my ruined suit jacket and began walking rapidly toward the subway terminal. I turned down a narrow, brick-lined alleyway to cut quickly across the city block. The alley smelled of rotting garbage and wet asphalt. I was exactly halfway down the dark passage when a heavy, unmarked black sport utility vehicle suddenly accelerated from the opposite end, violently cutting off my path. The high-beam headlights flared to life, blinding me instantly in the darkness. I threw my arm up over my face to shield my eyes, immediately stepping backward toward the main street. Before I could even turn my body around, two massive figures stepped out from the deep shadows behind a commercial dumpster, completely blocking my only exit. They were definitely not random street thugs looking for a quick robbery. They were heavily muscled men wearing dark tactical gear, and they carried themselves with the disciplined, highly aggressive posture of trained law enforcement. I easily recognized the distinct heavy shape of police-issued steel batons resting loosely in their hands. They were off-duty city officers working privately on my father's payroll. They were the exact same kind of violent men Richard routinely used to privately intimidate local contractors, silence noisy journalists, and crush labor disputes. The larger of the two men did not bother to say a single word. He simply stepped forward, closed the distance in a fraction of a second, and drove his heavy combat boot directly into my stomach. All the air violently exploded from my lungs in a ragged gasp. I instantly collapsed onto the wet, filthy asphalt, choking and desperately fighting for breath. Before I could even attempt to raise my hands to defend my face, the second man grabbed me roughly by the collar of my torn jacket. He hauled me upward and slammed my shoulders aggressively against the rough brick wall of the alley. The back of my head cracked violently against the masonry, sending a blinding, sickening flash of white light across my vision. The first officer casually reached into my jacket and violently yanked out the cylindrical stack of library documents I had just printed. He unrolled the pages, holding them up to the dim glare of the distant street lamp. He scanned the top sheet, reading the bold letters detailing the Apex Logistics insurance waiver. He let out a low, deeply mocking chuckle that echoed off the brick walls. He looked down at me, bleeding, gasping, and shivering on the ground. Without breaking eye contact, he calmly placed his hands on the thick stack of evidence and began tearing the documents into tiny, completely unrecognizable pieces. He casually tossed the shredded paper into a large, muddy puddle at his feet, standing there and watching with amusement as the freezing rain quickly dissolved the black ink into absolute nothingness. My proof was entirely gone. He grabbed a brutal fistful of my wet hair, yanking my head back and forcing me to look directly up into his cold, dead eyes. His breath smelled heavily of stale tobacco and peppermint gum. He leaned his face inches from mine and delivered a message that chilled me far deeper than the winter storm. He told me that my father was growing extremely tired of my pathetic, highly emotional public outbursts. He said Richard had legally drafted an ironclad, incredibly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. The document officially released Preston Development and all associated subsidiaries from any and all liability regarding my wife's unfortunate tragic highway accident. The officer leaned in closer aggressively, pressing the cold, heavy steel of his baton directly against my bruised throat, cutting off my air supply. He told me that if I did not walk into the corporate headquarters tomorrow morning, sign the legal document, and accept a meager cash settlement, I would simply disappear from society. He calmly explained exactly how my father had already arranged for a highly corrupt local judge to sign an involuntary emergency psychiatric commitment order in my name. He promised me with terrifying sincerity that if I kept digging into the Apex Logistics crash, I would spend the absolute rest of my natural life heavily medicated and locked inside a state-run mental asylum. I would be permanently stripped of all my basic human rights, declared legally incompetent, and locked in a padded room while Trent quietly liquidated my foreclosed home and laughed at my memory. The second officer stepped forward and kicked me in the bruised ribs one final time, driving his boot in hard, just to ensure I fully understood the extreme gravity of the situation. The sharp, agonizing sound of my rib cracking echoed loudly in the narrow alley. They dropped me onto the wet pavement like a bag of garbage. They turned around in perfect unison, climbed into the idling black vehicle, and slammed the doors. The heavy tires spun aggressively on the slick asphalt as they rapidly reversed out of the alley, leaving me completely alone, bleeding and shattered in the dark. Blood was still dripping steadily from my hairline, mixing with the freezing Chicago rain that soaked my ruined dark suit. Every shallow breath I took sent a jagged spike of pure agony tearing through my cracked ribs. It was a brutal, unrelenting reminder of the severe beating my father's off-duty mercenaries had just delivered in that dark industrial alley. My vision swam with sudden flashes of blinding white light, but I forced my trembling hands to maintain a death grip on the steering wheel of my practical sedan. I was operating entirely on raw adrenaline and a profound, devastating rage. They had shredded my printed proof. They had completely destroyed the physical documents linking their corrupt logistics company to the horrific highway death of my wife and my 7-year-old son. But they could not erase the absolute truth from my burning mind. I knew exactly where my parents were spending their evening. It was the third Friday of the month, which meant Richard and Patricia Preston were holding court at the elite Oak Creek Heritage Club. The country club was a sprawling, opulent fortress of old money and deep political corruption nestled securely behind towering wrought iron gates in the most exclusive, wealthy zip code of the state. It was an insulated sanctuary where million-dollar commercial zoning permits were quietly approved over expensive scotch and prime rib, completely removed from the harsh consequences of the real world. I pulled my battered vehicle straight up the long, perfectly manicured circular driveway, completely ignoring the horrified valet attendants who frantically waved their illuminated traffic wands at me. I threw the heavy transmission into park, leaving the car idling aggressively right in front of the grand mahogany entrance doors. I stumbled out into the bitter cold downpour. My soaked leather shoes slipped dangerously on the polished marble steps, but I caught my balance against the heavy brass door handles. I pushed them open with all the remaining strength in my aching shoulders, stepping out of the storm and into a world of absolute sickening luxury. The main dining room was a massive sea of glittering crystal chandeliers, pristine white silk tablecloths, and the soft, elegant hum of live chamber music. The town's wealthiest real estate developers, influential politicians, and elite socialites were gathered in their finest evening wear, laughing and clinking imported champagne glasses. And sitting right in the exact center of the vast room at the most prominent elevated table were my parents. Richard was wearing a flawless, bespoke tuxedo, holding a glass of aged amber bourbon, and telling a highly animated story to the local district attorney. Patricia sat perfectly poised beside him, her neck heavily draped in flawless diamonds, smiling graciously at the wealthy sycophants surrounding their table. They looked so incredibly untouched by the horrific tragedy they had personally orchestrated. They were literally drinking to the massive financial success of Trent's public offering, while my entire family lay trapped in freshly dug muddy graves. I did not hesitate for a single second. I marched directly across the plush imported carpet, leaving a thick, visible trail of muddy, bloody footprints right through the exact center of the grand dining hall. The elegant, hushed conversations began to die out instantly as the wealthy patrons finally noticed the battered, bleeding man moving violently through their exclusive sanctuary. Professional waiters holding heavy silver trays froze completely in their tracks. The live chamber music abruptly and awkwardly stopped. I reached my parents' table and slammed my bloody, bruised hands down violently onto the crisp white linen, rattling their expensive silver cutlery and crystal glasses. My father looked up, his smug, confident smile instantly vanishing into a rigid mask of fury. Patricia let out a sharp theatrical gasp, bringing a perfectly manicured hand to her chest in feigned terror. I did not care who was listening or watching. I wanted the entire opulent room to hear exactly what these absolute monsters truly were. I raised my voice, letting the raw, agonizing grief and pure hatred tear completely through my damaged throat. I screamed that their unchecked corporate greed had murdered my innocent family. I pointed a trembling, blood-stained finger directly at Richard and loudly told the entire silent room about the dark, money-funding Apex Logistics. I shouted that my billionaire father had systematically bribed state transit regulators to keep Trent's decaying, dangerous freight trucks on the public highway just to save capital for his real estate venture. I turned my head and looked the district attorney right in the eyes, loudly declaring that my beautiful wife and my sweet son were brutally crushed to death simply because the Preston family refused to pay for basic mechanical truck repairs. The silence in the grand dining room was absolutely deafening. 100 wealthy, powerful patrons stared at me in horrified, paralyzed shock. For one fleeting desperate second, I actually thought I had broken through their wall of privilege. I thought the sheer, undeniable, tragic truth of my public accusation would finally expose the rotting criminal core of the Preston corporate empire. But I had severely underestimated my mother's endless capacity for calculated, manipulative cruelty. Patricia did not panic. She did not argue or attempt to deny my specific claims. Instead, she stood up slowly, her eyes suddenly welling with perfectly timed, highly convincing tears. She looked around at her wealthy friends, portraying the ultimate flawless picture of a devastated, heartbroken matriarch. She raised her voice just loud enough to project a trembling, tragic sorrow across the massive room. She begged the crowd to please forgive her troubled youngest son. She cried out that the sudden, horrific loss of his dear wife and precious child had completely shattered his fragile mind. She wept openly, covering her face with her trembling hands, loudly claiming that my profound grief had triggered a terrifying paranoid psychosis. She masterfully spun a narrative that I had been suffering from severe mental delusions for months, and that the highway accident had completely severed my final tether to reality. She played the tragic victim with absolute terrifying perfection, completely weaponizing my own agonizing tragedy against me in front of the town's most powerful citizens. The emotional atmosphere of the crowd immediately and drastically shifted. The faces around the opulent room transformed rapidly from horrified shock to deep, pitying sympathy for my parents. They looked at me no longer as a grieving father exposing a massive criminal conspiracy, but as a dangerous, completely unhinged lunatic having a violent public meltdown. While Patricia skillfully captured the emotional attention of the wealthy audience, Richard slowly stood up and stepped around the dining table. He approached me with a practiced look of calm, paternal concern, purely for the benefit of the watching onlookers. But as he wrapped his strong, heavy arm around my shoulder in a fake public gesture of comfort, he leaned his face extremely close to mine. His voice dropped to a sinister, chilling whisper that only I could hear over my mother's theatrical sobbing. He told me I was making a pathetic, embarrassing fool of myself over absolutely nothing. He hissed directly into my ear that Sarah was never the innocent, loving wife I thought she was. He claimed my wife was nothing but a pathetic, snooping corporate gold digger who got entirely too greedy trying to blackmail the Preston family. He calmly stated that the extreme psychological pressure of her own failed corporate espionage had caused her to panic, resulting in her driving herself and my son right off the interstate out of sheer, terrified stress. He completely blamed Sarah for her own violent death, spitting viciously on her memory while simultaneously smiling warmly and reassuringly at the watching crowd. I tried to lunge at him. I wanted to wrap my bleeding hands tightly around his throat and squeeze the corrupt life completely out of his lungs. But before I could even raise my aching arms, Richard swiftly pulled a folded, heavy, cream-colored legal document from the interior silk pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He shoved it forcefully against my chest, tapping the thick paper with his index finger. I stumbled backward, catching the heavy paper before it fell. My tired eyes darted quickly across the bold, black legal heading. It was an official, legally binding court order recently signed by Judge Harmon, a man who frequently played golf with my father on Sunday mornings. It was a 72-hour involuntary emergency psychiatric hold, combined with a comprehensive, highly restrictive restraining order. The legal mandate explicitly demanded that I remain at least 500 yards away from any member of the Preston family, their residences, or their vast corporate assets. Richard looked at me with cold, triumphant, dead eyes. He told me the local police dispatch was already on their way to safely escort me directly to the state psychiatric facility. He smirked maliciously and whispered that I would be heavily medicated, strapped to a hospital bed, and locked in a padded white room long before midnight. I would be officially stripped of all my legal autonomy. As if directly on cue, the faint wailing sound of approaching police sirens pierced through the howling storm outside, growing rapidly louder and more aggressive as they sped toward the country club gates. I looked down at the damning legal document in my hand and then up at the wealthy crowd murmuring in full sympathetic agreement with my father's fabricated narrative. I was completely, expertly trapped. If I stayed and attempted to physically fight the arriving police officers, I would be violently subdued, legally institutionalized, and permanently discredited as a violent, dangerous schizophrenic. Sarah's hidden forensic ledger would never be found. My murdered son would never get his justice. I turned and ran. I shoved my way aggressively through the thick crowd of elite patrons, knocking over a tall silver tray of champagne glasses that shattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I sprinted desperately toward the kitchen service doors, bypassing the main elegant lobby entirely. I burst through the heavy, swinging metal doors, startling the busy kitchen staff, and bolted down the narrow, tiled service corridor toward the rear loading dock. I burst out into the freezing black rain just as two local police cruisers skidded to a chaotic halt near the front entrance, their flashing red and blue lights brightly illuminating the dark, violent storm. I sprinted blindly through the muddy, expensive landscaping, completely ignoring the burning, sharp pain in my cracked ribs until I reached my idling sedan. I threw myself heavily into the driver's seat, slammed the transmission into gear, and accelerated aggressively away from the country club. I kept my headlights completely turned off until I was a full mile down the dark, winding suburban road, deeply terrified that a patrol car would spot my fleeing vehicle. My heart was pounding a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my aching chest. I desperately needed to regroup. I needed dry, warm clothes, the emergency backup cash I kept hidden securely in my home office, and a safe, quiet place to strategically plan my next move to find Sarah's hidden master ledger. The bank had officially issued a 72-hour eviction notice on my front door earlier today, which legally meant I still had 3 days to gather my personal belongings from the property before the bank seized the structure. I drove cautiously through the torrential rain, taking dark, empty back roads to avoid any active police patrols until I finally reached my quiet, familiar neighborhood. I pulled slowly into my driveway, but immediately slammed my foot heavily onto the brakes. The entire residential property was blindingly illuminated by harsh industrial-grade portable floodlights. I sat frozen in the dark interior of my car, staring through the rain-streaked windshield in absolute paralyzing horror. 2 massive, heavily armored security vehicles were parked directly on my front lawn, completely destroying the green grass I used to joyfully mow with Leo on Sunday afternoons. 4 heavily armed private security contractors wearing thick black tactical vests were actively and aggressively patrolling the outer perimeter of my home. The front wooden door was propped wide open, and several hired workers were actively carrying large, heavy cardboard boxes filled entirely with my personal life belongings out into the freezing rain. They were tossing the boxes carelessly into a massive rented commercial dumpster sitting in the street. I narrowed my eyes, squinting through the thick darkness, and saw that the front brass lock had been completely drilled out and brutally replaced with a heavy steel industrial deadbolt. Trent had absolutely no intention of waiting the legally mandated 72 hours. He had completely bypassed the standard slow judicial eviction process, utilizing his vast corporate wealth and corrupt local political connections to illegally seize my private property the very same day. They were actively, systematically destroying everything I had ever owned or loved. I watched helplessly as Sarah's favorite winter clothes, Leo's beloved childhood reading books, and our beautifully bound wedding photo albums were tossed mercilessly into the freezing mud like common, worthless garbage. I gripped the leather steering wheel so hard my hands began to cramp desperately, wanting to drive my heavy car straight into the armored security trucks and fight every single mercenary bare-handed. But my analytical mind quickly calculated exactly how that scenario would end. I was one severely bruised, exhausted, grieving man attempting to fight a privately funded corporate militia. I would be brutally beaten, arrested, handed over directly to the corrupt local police, and permanently locked inside the psychiatric ward, exactly as my father had planned. I shifted the car quietly into reverse and slowly backed out of the driveway, remaining completely invisible in the dark, unforgiving storm. I watched my beautiful home and all my precious memories fade away completely in the rearview mirror. I was officially and completely homeless. I had absolutely no money, no career, no family, and nowhere left to run. I drove aimlessly out into the sprawling, endless grid of the dark city, utterly consumed by the cold, devastating reality of my absolute total ruin. The neon sign above the motel office buzzed with a harsh, erratic rhythm, casting a sickly pink glow across the flooded parking lot. I pulled my battered sedan into a space near the back tire, scraping against a shattered concrete parking block. For the past 2 hours, I had been driving aimlessly through the darkest outer edges of Chicago, completely hollowed out by the sheer scale of my destruction. Every road looked exactly the same. Every intersection was just another reminder that I had absolutely no destination left in this world. My father and my brother had successfully orchestrated a total systematic erasure of my existence. They took my pristine suburban house. They froze the bank accounts holding my life savings. They manipulated my employer into firing me. They weaponized the local legal system to hunt me down like a rabid dog. And they did it all while smiling at a country club dinner. I turned off the ignition and sat in the dark, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain against the metal roof of the car. My chest violently throbbed with every single breath. The cracked rib throbbed like a hot iron spike buried deep under my skin, a physical souvenir from the off-duty mercenaries who had ambushed me in the alleyway. I slowly unbuckled my seatbelt and reached into my pocket, pulling out a crumpled, damp wad of bills. It was $38 and some loose change. The absolute sum total of my worldly wealth. I stepped out into the freezing storm and dragged my bruised, exhausted body toward the front office. The lobby smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. A heavily tattooed clerk sitting behind a thick pane of scratched, bulletproof glass did not even look up from his phone when I slid the wet money through the metal transaction slot. He wordlessly tossed a heavy brass keyring back at me. Room number 12. I walked back out into the freezing rain and navigated down the exterior concrete corridor. The building was in a severe state of decay. Paint peeled from the walls in long curled strips, and the overhead light fixtures flickered violently in the storm. I shoved the key into the rusted lock and pushed the heavy door open. The interior of the room was a perfect physical reflection of my current reality. It was completely dark, decaying, and utterly devoid of hope. I reached for the wall switch, illuminating a single bare bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling. The harsh yellow light revealed a space completely consumed by rot. The carpet was a murky, unrecognizable shade of brown, heavily stained with years of neglect. A small television set sat perched on top of a scratched wooden dresser, bolted securely to the wall. The bed was nothing more than a sagging mattress covered by a thin, faded floral bedspread. As I stepped fully into the room, a pair of large brown cockroaches instantly scurried across the baseboards, disappearing rapidly into a crack near the bathroom door. I did not care. The disgusting condition of the motel simply did not matter. I slowly closed the heavy door behind me, throwing the deadbolt lock. I leaned my full body weight against the cheap wood, sliding slowly down until I hit the filthy floor. I sat there in the silence, with my knees pulled up tightly to my chest, wrapping my bleeding arms around my legs. This was the absolute bottom, the terrifying pitch-black abyss of human suffering. I closed my eyes and allowed the horrific reality of the past 24 hours to finally catch up to my analytical mind. I had lost my beautiful, brilliant wife. I had lost my innocent, sweet 7-year-old boy. I had been forced to bury them completely alone in the freezing mud, while the people who shared my blood drank expensive champagne. I had lost my quiet, stable career. My reputation was completely shredded by my own mother, who had masterfully convinced the wealthiest people in the city that I was a dangerous, violent lunatic. My father had actively signed a fraudulent legal order to throw me into a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life. They had taken everything. I was officially a ghost, a homeless broken fugitive hiding in a $40 motel room with no friends, no allies, and no conceivable way to fight back. The intense burning rage that had sustained me at the country club was completely gone. It was entirely burned out, replaced by an overwhelming, crushing wave of absolute despair. I was a corporate actuary who had spent his entire adult life mitigating risk and avoiding catastrophe. But no mathematical model in the world could have predicted this level of pure, concentrated evil from my own flesh and blood. I had failed Sarah. I had failed Leo. I had let my corrupt family murder them, and then I allowed those same monsters to systematically destroy the evidence. I pushed myself up from the floor, my joints popping and protesting loudly against the movement. I limped slowly toward the sagging bed. My wetsuit jacket felt like a lead weight hanging off my shoulders. I stripped it off, letting it fall carelessly onto the stained carpet. I unbuttoned my ruined shirt, wincing in sharp agony as the fabric dragged across the dark purple bruises blooming across my ribcage. I sat on the edge of the mattress, staring blankly at the peeling wallpaper. My mind was completely numb. I needed to grab the single item I had managed to salvage from my vehicle before the security forces had thrown all my possessions into a dumpster. When I had briefly returned to my driveway to see Trent's mercenaries clearing out my house, I had noticed one specific object lying discarded in the mud near the street. I had opened my car door, scooped it up quickly, and thrown it onto my passenger seat before fleeing into the night. I stood up, walked back to the door, and reached into the side pocket of my discarded wet jacket. I pulled out a small brown stuffed bear. It was Leo's favorite toy. He called it Barnaby. We had bought it for him at a small roadside carnival when he was just 3 years old. The bear was heavily worn, its soft brown fur matted from years of being dragged through the dirt, held tightly during scary thunderstorms, and squeezed lovingly during thousands of bedtime stories. One of the black plastic button eyes was missing, lost during a family camping trip 2 summers ago. Sarah had spent an entire evening trying to sew a replacement button onto the fabric, laughing as she pricked her finger with the needle. The bear had miraculously survived the highway crash. The police investigators must have tossed it into the recovery box, along with Sarah's personal effects. Looking at it now, covered in dark street mud and smelling of rain, broke something fundamental and foundational deep inside my soul. The dam I had been desperately building inside my mind for the past 5 days finally and violently collapsed. I collapsed back onto the edge of the motel bed, pulling the small stuffed animal tightly against my chest. A raw, visceral, agonizing sob tore its way out of my throat. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a loud, terrifying sound, resembling an animal caught in a brutal steel trap. The physical pain in my broken ribs was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic emotional agony ripping my heart into shreds. I buried my face deeply into the damp, worn fabric of the toy, inhaling deeply, hoping to catch even the faintest, lingering scent of my beautiful boy. I cried until my lungs burned. I cried for the bright future Leo would never get to experience. I cried for the brilliant, fearless woman who had loved me enough to fight a corrupt empire entirely on her own. I cried for my own pathetic weakness, for not seeing the danger, for not protecting them, for believing that I could just live a quiet, peaceful life while my family operated a criminal syndicate right down the street. I rocked back and forth on the stained mattress, entirely consumed by a grief so heavy and suffocating that I actively wished the roof of the motel would cave in and end my misery. I wanted to die. Sitting in that putrid room, holding a muddy stuffed bear, I genuinely, deeply wanted the world to simply fade to black. I squeezed the small brown bear aggressively against my chest, wrapping my arms around it as if holding it tight enough could somehow magically transport me back in time. I gripped the center of the plush toy, pushing my fingers deep into the soft cotton stuffing. But the center of the bear was not soft. My fingers met severe, sudden resistance. I stopped rocking. The loud, ragged sobbing echoing in the tiny motel room caught abruptly in my throat. I blinked the heavy tears away from my burning eyes, staring down at the toy in my lap. I slowly loosened my grip, running my thumb carefully along the back seam of the bear. Deep beneath the outer layer of matted brown fur and cotton padding, there was a distinct, solid mass. It was completely rigid, featuring sharp, precise right angles. It felt like a small metallic rectangular box. My analytical mind immediately snapped back into focus, instantly overriding the paralyzing waves of emotional grief. I wiped my face violently with the back of my hand, clearing my vision. I held the bear up to the harsh, flickering yellow light of the overhead bulb. I turned the toy around carefully, inspecting the fabric running down the center of its back. Sarah had always been meticulous. She was a forensic accountant who spent her entire professional career noticing the tiny, invisible details that everyone else completely ignored. As I ran my fingernail along the thick seam running down the bear's spine, I noticed the stitching was slightly uneven. The thread used to seal the back was a slightly darker shade of brown than the original factory threading. It was the exact same heavy-duty upholstery thread I kept in a small sewing kit in our kitchen pantry. Sarah had opened the bear, removed a portion of the internal stuffing, placed a solid object inside, and meticulously sewed it back together. My heart began to race, pumping a fresh, massive surge of highly oxygenated blood directly into my exhausted muscles. I remembered the terrifying, frantic words she had spoken on the tablet video back at the diner. She had looked directly into the camera and explicitly stated that she hid the master ledger where they would never ever think to look. My father and my brother were ruthless, wealthy corporate monsters who searched through bank vaults, safety deposit boxes, and encrypted digital servers. They would never ever think to rip open a dirty, cheap stuffed animal belonging to a dead 7-year-old boy. I did not hesitate for another second. I grabbed the fabric on both sides of the dark, uneven seam. I pulled aggressively, tearing the thick threads completely apart. The back of the bear ripped open with a sharp, snapping sound, spilling white cotton stuffing down onto the filthy motel carpet. I dug my trembling fingers deep inside the hollow cavity of the toy, searching blindly through the remaining padding. My knuckles scraped against something freezing cold and solid. I clamped my hand tightly around the object and pulled it free from the fabric, holding it up directly into the glaring light. It was a heavy industrial-grade titanium external USB storage drive. The metal casing was thick, incredibly durable, and heavily encrypted. It was the exact type of high-security data drive corporate forensic auditors used to store highly classified, sensitive financial documents. But the drive was not alone. Securely attached to the small metal loop at the end of the titanium casing by a thin, braided steel wire was a single object. It was a small, precisely cut brass key. It was not a standard house key or a simple padlock key. I recognized the unique, complex groove pattern instantly. It was a high-security physical authentication key used exclusively for accessing private subterranean safety deposit vaults at elite commercial banking institutions. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the heavy metal drive and the brass key resting in the palm of my bloody, bruised hand. The profound, debilitating grief that had completely paralyzed me only moments ago was instantly and permanently replaced by a cold, lethal clarity. Sarah had not just left me a vague clue or a desperate plea for justice. She had methodically, intentionally provided me with a fully loaded weapon. She had documented every single bribe, every forged signature, every illegal wire transfer, and every mechanical violation. She had engineered a master kill switch capable of completely annihilating the Preston corporate empire. I tightly closed my fist around the cold titanium drive, feeling the sharp edges bite firmly into my skin. My father had stolen my house. My brother had stolen my name. They had murdered my wife and my son for a profit margin, and then they had the absolute arrogant audacity to believe I would just lay down and disappear into a psychiatric ward. They were completely wrong. I was no longer the quiet, passive disappointment they could easily push aside. I slowly stood up from the stained bed, completely ignoring the sharp, burning pain in my broken ribs. I looked around the dark, decaying motel room, and for the very first time since the devastating highway crash, I finally knew exactly what I was going to do next. I was going to follow my brave, brilliant wife's final instructions. I was going to take the loaded gun she left behind, and I was going to burn their entire world straight to the ground. The raw, freezing air of the early Chicago morning bit viciously into my exposed skin as I walked away from the decaying motel. The torrential rain had finally slowed to a heavy, dismal drizzle, but the cold remained absolute and unforgiving. I had exactly $38 crumpled in my pocket. That pathetic amount of money was barely enough to purchase a hot meal, let alone the sophisticated computer hardware I desperately needed to unlock my wife's final secret. But I was wearing a stainless steel chronograph watch tightly secured around my left wrist. It was an incredibly expensive graduation gift given to me by my father many years ago, from a time when he still bothered to pretend he cared about my existence. I walked over 2 miles down the desolate neon-lit industrial boulevard until I finally found a 24-hour pawn shop guarded by thick, heavy iron bars. I walked inside and placed the luxury timepiece flat on the scratched glass counter. I traded a flawless $5,000 watch for a bulky, outdated laptop and a cheap, prepaid cellular internet terminal. I did not care about the massive financial loss. That watch was a meaningless symbol of a family that never truly existed. I carried the heavy plastic laptop back through the rain to my miserable, roach-infested motel room. My bruised hands were perfectly steady as I sat cross-legged on the heavily stained carpet. I flipped open the monitor screen and pressed the power button. The old internal cooling fan whirred loudly to life, filling the dark, silent room with a steady mechanical hum. I reached into my pocket and took out the heavy industrial-grade titanium USB drive I had ripped from the chest of my dead son's stuffed bear. I pushed the metal drive firmly into the side port of the computer and waited for the operating system to recognize the foreign device. A stark white password prompt instantly flashed across the glowing monitor. My heart pounded an erratic, painful rhythm against my fractured ribs. I typed in the exact date we brought Leo home from the maternity ward. The progress bar immediately turned green. The drive unlocked with a soft digital chime, and a single massive encrypted folder appeared directly in the center of the desktop. It was titled simply Preston Holdings Master Audit. I opened the file, and the entire rotting, corrupt foundation of my father's real estate empire violently spilled across the screen. Sarah had not just casually investigated their corporate finances. She had completely and professionally dissected them with the precision of a master surgeon. I stared in absolute awe at thousands of pages of meticulously organized corporate ledgers, hidden offshore bank statements, and classified internal email communications. My wife was an absolute forensic genius. She had successfully bypassed a dozen expensive layers of elite corporate security to meticulously map out every single dirty dollar flowing through the veins of Preston Development. I scrolled rapidly through the digital archives and found the exact subfolder labeled Mezzanine Debt. My breathing turned incredibly shallow as I opened the highly classified files. There it was, staring right back at me in high definition. It was the complete, undeniable legal proof of Trent's massive, sophisticated Ponzi scheme. I saw the original, unredacted commercial loan applications. I saw the internal corporate emails where Trent explicitly ordered his legal team to completely forge my unconditional guarantor signature to leverage my residential property. He had casually gambled my entire life to cover a $2.5 million liquidity shortfall in his luxury condominium project, knowing full well the commercial bank would eventually seize my home and throw me onto the street. But the vast financial fraud was absolutely nothing compared to the innocent blood covering their hands. I opened a completely separate folder marked Apex Logistics. My chest tightened into a suffocating knot as I read through a long, detailed sequence of heavily encrypted wire transfers. The funds originated directly from my father's private offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and went straight into the personal checking accounts of 3 senior state transit inspectors. Sarah had successfully tracked the exact serial numbers of the massive bribes. My father had paid them tens of thousands of dollars in dark money to completely ignore the catastrophic mechanical failures of Trent's commercial supply trucks. I read the exact state maintenance reports my family had desperately tried to bury. The heavy air brakes on the specific commercial truck that crossed the highway median and killed my wife and son were actively disintegrating for 8 entire months. A state-certified mechanic had officially warned Trent's senior logistics manager that the massive vehicle was a rolling death trap entirely unfit for public roads. My father had personally authorized a $10,000 bribe the very next morning to ensure that exact truck was granted a fraudulent safety waiver and returned immediately to the highway. They traded the beautiful, innocent lives of my family for the meager cost of cheap brake pads. A suffocating wave of profound, lethal clarity washed completely over me. I wiped a stray cold tear from my cheek and continued digging relentlessly through the route directory of the titanium drive. Below the staggering mountain of damning evidence, I found a highly unique executable program file. It featured a simple stark black icon shaped like a closed padlock. I double-clicked the icon and a sleek, highly customized command interface immediately filled the entire monitor. Sarah had brilliant engineered a digital dead man switch. It was an automated, incredibly aggressive mass distribution protocol. The program was hardwired directly to a hidden private proxy server completely beyond the legal reach of my father's high-priced, aggressive corporate attorneys. The primary delivery fields were already permanently populated with external contacts. The recipient list included the highest-ranking directors at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Domestic Corruption Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Criminal Investigation Unit of the Internal Revenue Service, and the senior investigative editors of every major national news network in the country. If I successfully activated this specific program, it would simultaneously blast the entire unredacted forensic ledger to every federal authority and major media outlet in America. It would trigger an immediate, massive, multi-agency federal raid on Preston Development corporate headquarters. The resulting catastrophic media explosion would cause Trent's highly anticipated public offering to completely crash and burn before the stock market bell even had a chance to ring. It was a digital nuclear bomb carefully and flawlessly designed to instantly, permanently vaporize their wealth, their freedom, and their elite social standing. I moved the computer cursor directly over the bright red execution button located at the bottom right corner of the screen. My bruised hand trembled with an eager, violent anticipation. I firmly pressed the trackpad, ready to finally end this waking nightmare and secure absolute justice for my family. A harsh, aggressive error tone beeped loudly from the cheap laptop speakers. The bright red execution button instantly grayed out, and a secondary security window popped up, completely blocking the launch command. The screen explicitly demanded a final physical alphanumeric authentication protocol before the data could be released. A pre-recorded video message from Sarah automatically played in the center of the monitor. She was sitting in our home office looking incredibly tired but fiercely resolute. Her voice was steady and highly professional, completely devoid of the raw terror she had shown in the previous diner recording. "Nate," she said, looking directly and intensely into the camera lens. "If you have made it this far into the drive, you know exactly what they have done to us. But you also know that your powerful father has enough political capital and financial resources to easily dismiss a sudden digital leak as a fabricated, malicious cyber attack. He will hire a dozen expensive elite cybersecurity experts to claim this drive was completely manipulated by a disgruntled employee. To make this execution absolutely bulletproof and legally undeniable, you critically need the physical sworn affidavits." I quietly tracked down 3 former corporate accountants who helped Richard launder the initial transit bribes. I covertly recorded their confessions, and I forced them to sign legally binding notarized affidavits openly admitting to their role in the entire criminal conspiracy. Those physical documents are the absolute undeniable key to legally validating this entire digital ledger in a federal court of law. The distribution program requires the unique alphanumeric sequence stamped directly on the bottom of those physical papers to launch the dead man's switch. She paused, taking a deep, shaky breath, gathering her emotional resolve. I securely locked the physical affidavits inside a highly classified commercial safety deposit box. You are the only person on Earth who can access it. I set up the vault account strictly and exclusively under your name. I love you, Nate. Please finish this for us. The video closed instantly, leaving me staring blankly at the blinking cursor demanding the physical alphanumeric code. I reached slowly into my damp suit pocket and pulled out the small precision-cut brass key I had found attached to the titanium drive. I held the heavy metal up to the harsh flickering light of the bare bulb hanging from the motel ceiling. Deeply engraved into the solid brass was a highly distinct, intricate corporate crest featuring 2 crossed oak branches and a unique vault serial number. I did not need to search the internet to identify the corporate logo. Every single wealthy, influential family in Chicago instantly recognized that specific prestigious crest. It belonged exclusively to First Republic Bank. It was the most exclusive, heavily fortified commercial banking institution in the entire metropolitan district, and it was exactly the location where my brother Trent was officially scheduled to host his highly publicized $500 million initial public offering signing event tomorrow morning. My blood ran completely ice-cold in my veins. Trent and my father had aggressively rented out the entire grand marble lobby of the First Republic Bank flagship branch to publicly celebrate their fraudulent Wall Street victory. The massive building would be absolutely swarming with their private, heavily armed corporate security contractors, a heavy presence of local law enforcement, and aggressive flashing media cameras. The primary safety deposit vault was located directly beneath the main lobby floor, accessible only by a single secured elevator. Sarah had intentionally chosen First Republic Bank because their subterranean vaults required an advanced, highly sophisticated 2-step biometric authentication process. No one could simply forge a signature break, a lock, or bribe a teller clerk to open the steel box. The advanced vault mechanism absolutely required the physical brass key currently sitting in the palm of my hand and a direct authorized retinal scan from the primary account holder. Since Sarah had specifically registered the security box exclusively in my name, I was literally the only living human being capable of unlocking it. The stark, terrifying reality of the impossible situation rapidly crystallized in my highly analytical mind. I could not simply wait for a quiet, relaxing afternoon next week to casually retrieve the documents. My father had already successfully secured a fraudulent emergency psychiatric hold against me through his corrupt judicial connections. Every single dirty police officer on his massive payroll was currently actively scouring the city streets searching for my face. If I waited even one more day, I would inevitably be captured, dragged forcefully into a state mental hospital, and heavily sedated until the end of my natural life. My only remaining window of opportunity was right now, while they still confidently believed I was a broken, terrified fugitive, hiding helplessly in the dark shadows. I had to walk directly into the exact building where the ruthless men who murdered my family were celebrating their ultimate financial victory. I had to somehow bypass a private army of heavily armed corporate mercenaries, seamlessly navigate a high-security commercial bank lobby, completely filled with wealthy elite investors, and manually access a heavily guarded subterranean vault just to retrieve the execution code. I looked down at my ruined, filthy suit, my mud-stained shoes, and my bruised, bleeding hands. I had exactly 3 hours before the sun came up and the financial markets officially opened for business. I calmly closed the cheap plastic laptop, placing it carefully into a plastic grocery bag along with the small, brown stuffed bear. I gripped the heavy brass key so tightly the metal edges sliced directly into my palm, drawing fresh blood. I was a quiet, predictable corporate actuary who had spent his entire life desperately avoiding conflict and hiding from danger. But as I walked out of that rotting, miserable motel room and stepped out into the freezing gray Chicago dawn, I left my fear completely behind. I was going to walk right into the center of the lion's den, and I was absolutely not going to leave until the Preston Empire burned to ash. The freezing Chicago morning broke with a dull gray light as I walked away from the decaying motel. I had exactly $38 left in my pocket. It was barely enough to buy a hot meal, but I did not feel hunger. I felt only the cold, heavy weight of the titanium drive in my hand and a burning desire for absolute justice. To bypass the army of private security guarding the First Republic Bank, I could not look like a battered, homeless fugitive. I needed to become completely invisible. I needed to blend flawlessly into the wealthy corporate background of my brother's massive financial celebration. I waited outside a discount thrift store 2 miles down the road until the manager unlocked the front doors at 7 in the morning. I used my final damp dollar bills to purchase a cheap, ill-fitting charcoal gray suit, a stiff white dress shirt, and a disposable plastic razor. I walked across the street to a filthy gas station bathroom. I stripped off my ruined, muddy funeral clothes and stood in front of the cracked mirror. I turned on the rusted faucet and splashed freezing water over my face, violently scrubbing away the dried blood and dark street mud. I dragged the cheap, dry razor across my jaw, scraping away the heavy stubble until my skin burned. I carefully put on the stiff white shirt and the cheap gray jacket. The synthetic fabric smelled faintly of mothballs and old dust, but it covered the dark purple bruises blooming across my ribs. When I looked back into the mirror, the broken, grieving father was completely gone. I looked exactly like an exhausted, low-level corporate accountant. I was an anonymous, invisible ghost, ready to walk directly into the center of the lion's den. The scene outside the First Republic Bank flagship branch was absolute total madness. Trent and my father had orchestrated a massive public relations spectacle for their $500 million initial public offering. The entire city block was heavily barricaded. Sleek black news vans were parked illegally along the curb with satellite dishes extended toward the sky. Aggressive reporters and bright flashing camera crews crowded around a velvet rope completely surrounding the grand marble entrance. Massive silk banners displaying the Preston Development corporate logo hung proudly from the towering stone columns of the financial institution. My heart hammered a violent, painful rhythm against my fractured ribs as I approached the massive crowd. I kept my head down, clutching the cheap plastic grocery bag containing the burner laptop tightly against my side. I merged directly into a chaotic, rushing group of outside catering staff carrying heavy silver trays of expensive pastries. I walked with aggressive, urgent purpose, matching their hurried pace perfectly. The private security mercenaries standing at the front glass doors were far too busy managing the aggressive paparazzi to closely inspect the face of every single passing vendor. I slipped right past their heavy tactical vests and stepped through the revolving glass doors into the opulent belly of the beast. The main bank lobby was a staggering display of sickening, untouchable wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, warm light over hundreds of elite Wall Street investors, wealthy local politicians, and prominent socialites. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the dense crowd, offering crystal flutes of imported champagne. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the loud, arrogant laughter of people completely isolated from consequence. I moved cautiously along the far marble wall, desperately trying to remain completely unnoticed. Suddenly, my blood ran entirely cold. Less than 50 feet away, standing directly in the center of the grand room, was my father. Richard was holding court wearing a flawless, custom-tailored navy blue suit. He was smiling warmly, gripping the shoulder of the city mayor and laughing loudly at a private joke. My father looked so incredibly proud, so deeply satisfied with his stolen criminal empire. He was literally celebrating the peak of his financial power just 5 days after ordering the execution of my beautiful wife and my innocent young son. A dark, violent urge screamed in my mind, demanding that I walk over and wrap my bare hands directly around his throat. But I violently suppressed the instinct. I could not afford a single mistake. I needed to completely destroy the foundation of his entire life before I let him see my face. I quickly ducked behind a massive, towering floral arrangement just as Richard casually scanned the room. My chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. I watched intensely as a pair of Trent's heavy private security contractors walked past my hiding spot. I recognized the taller guard instantly. It was the exact same man who had brutally kicked me in the ribs in the dark alleyway last night. I held my breath, pressing my back hard against the cold marble wall until their heavy combat boots echoed away down the grand corridor. I slipped out from behind the flowers and moved rapidly toward the restricted administrative wing. I remembered the architectural layout of the bank from a corporate meeting I had attended years ago. The highly secured subterranean safety deposit vaults were completely isolated from the public lobby. I found the discreet polished steel elevator reserved exclusively for high net worth account holders. I pressed the call button and prayed to whoever was listening. The heavy metal doors slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lowest basement level just as one of my father's elite bodyguards turned his head in my direction. The steel doors glided shut, sealing me safely inside before the mercenary could register my face. The elevator descended smoothly, plunging deep beneath the busy, chaotic city streets. When the doors opened again, the loud, arrogant noise of the celebration above was completely gone. The subterranean vault level was dead silent, freezing cold and heavily armored. The environment was clinical and terrifying. I walked slowly down a long, sterile hallway, completely lined with reinforced concrete and thick steel blast doors. At the end of the corridor, a senior bank manager sat securely behind a massive wall of thick, bulletproof glass. I approached the transaction window, my hands shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the metal counter to hide my fear. I did not speak a single word. I simply reached into my cheap suit jacket, pulled out the precision-cut brass key, and slid it through the narrow transaction slot. The manager picked up the heavy brass key, examining the unique corporate engraving. He looked up at me with a blank, professional expression. He explicitly stated that accessing the primary subterranean boxes required secondary biometric authentication. He pointed to a high-tech retinal scanner mounted securely on the wall next to the reinforced glass. I stepped forward, placing my face carefully against the cold plastic visor of the scanning device. A bright green laser swept painlessly across my eye, reading the unique biological signature. For a terrifying, agonizing moment, the digital screen flashed an intimidating yellow processing signal. My entire plan, my entire desperate mission for absolute justice, hinged completely on Sarah successfully registering this private account strictly under my name. A soft, pleasant chime echoed through the silent concrete hallway. The digital screen turned a brilliant, solid green. The text read, "Authorization confirmed, primary account holder, Nathaniel Preston." The bank manager nodded politely. He pressed a heavy hidden button beneath his desk. A massive solid steel vault door buzzed loudly and slowly swung open on heavy industrial hinges. He instructed me to proceed to Section 8 and locate box number 814. I walked alone into the vast, imposing vault room. The walls were completely lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of small, polished steel doors. The silence in the room was incredibly heavy, suffocatingly quiet. I walked slowly down the long, metallic aisles, my footsteps echoing loudly against the polished tile floor. I found Section 8. I located the specific metal box. I inserted the heavy brass key into the complex locking mechanism and turned it firmly to the right. The internal tumblers clicked heavily into place. I pulled the small steel door open and slid the long metal container out from the wall. I placed it gently onto the pristine viewing table in the center of the room. My breathing was ragged and uneven as I lifted the metal lid. Inside the box, resting perfectly untouched, were 3 thick, heavy manila envelopes. I opened the first envelope and pulled out a stack of crisp, white legal documents. My eyes scanned the bold black text. It was a fully notarized, sworn legal affidavit explicitly detailing massive corporate fraud, bribery, and criminal conspiracy. At the very bottom of the page, printed directly beneath the clear official notary stamp, was a unique randomized alphanumeric sequence. It was the exact security code required to arm the digital dead man switch. I checked the other 2 envelopes, finding identical notarized confessions from the remaining corporate whistleblowers. Sarah had successfully engineered the absolute perfect airtight legal weapon. My father could never hire enough expensive lawyers to dispute 3 sworn federal confessions. I gathered the heavy documents ready to slide them into my jacket when I noticed one final item resting at the very bottom of the steel container. It was a simple, plain white envelope. My name was written across the center in blue ink. I stopped completely paralyzed by the familiar, elegant curves of the handwriting. It was Sarah's writing. I dropped the heavy legal documents onto the table and carefully picked up the delicate white envelope. My hands trembled as I gently broke the paper seal and unfolded the single sheet of stationery hidden inside. The message was brief, visceral, and absolutely heartbreaking. Nate, if you are reading this letter, it means my worst absolute fears have come true. It means I am gone, and you are standing alone in the dark. I am so incredibly deeply sorry for leaving you and our beautiful boy. I never wanted to be a hero. I only wanted to protect our quiet, perfect life from the monsters who share your last name. They think because you are a kind, gentle man that you are weak. They think they can simply step over you and erase us from the world. Please prove them entirely, completely wrong. Do not let your grief blind you. Do not let your fear stop you. Take the codes hidden in this box. Use the digital ledger I built for you. I love you, Nate. I love you more than breath itself. Burn their corrupt empire straight to the ground. A single heavy tear escaped my eye and dropped silently onto the crisp, white paper, blurring the blue ink of her signature. I did not break down. I did not collapse into a puddle of agonizing sorrow. The letter did not bring me pain. It brought me an incredible, terrifying, supernatural focus. I carefully folded her final written words and placed them directly over my heart in my interior breast pocket. I grabbed the 3 heavy manila envelopes containing the whistleblower affidavits and shoved them securely into the side pocket of my cheap suit jacket. I closed the metal safety deposit box and locked it securely, removing the brass key. I picked up my plastic grocery bag containing the burner laptop and walked out of the massive steel vault. The bank manager nodded silently as I passed his bulletproof window. I walked aggressively down the long, sterile concrete hallway, heading directly toward the heavy oak door that led back to the main subterranean elevator bank. I reached out, grasping the brass handle of the door. I was exactly 5 minutes away from finding a quiet, secure corner, tapping in the final alphanumeric codes, and launching the massive federal distribution protocol. I pulled the heavy oak door open, stepping confidently into the carpeted elevator lobby. I collided instantly and violently into the solid chest of another man stepping through from the opposite side. The physical impact knocked me backward a full step. The man cursed loudly, dropping an expensive cellular phone directly onto the carpeted floor. I quickly looked up, ready to mutter a quick generic apology, and rush past him into the waiting elevator car. My blood instantly froze, completely solid in my veins. Standing directly in front of me, wearing a flawless, bespoke gray suit and adjusting a custom silk tie, was my older brother Trent. He had apparently come down to the private administrative level to take a quiet phone call away from the massive, chaotic media celebration upstairs in the lobby. Trent looked highly annoyed as he bent down to retrieve his expensive phone. As he straightened back up, his dark, arrogant eyes locked directly onto my face. For one brief, agonizing second, he looked mildly confused by the cheap gray thrift store suit and the lack of facial hair. Then his eyes widened slightly, taking in the dark, severe bruising blooming prominently along my jawline. Total, complete recognition instantly washed over his face. The annoyance vanished, replaced immediately by a slow, cruel, malevolent smirk. He looked me up and down, taking in my completely pathetic, desperate appearance. He did not look like a man who had just bumped into his grieving homeless brother. He looked like a predator who had just successfully cornered a wounded, helpless animal. Trent slowly placed his phone into his pocket and took a deliberate, threatening step forward, completely physically, blocking the only set of elevator doors. He did not raise his voice. He simply smiled a wicked, victorious smile and raised his hand, casually waving toward the end of the hallway. 2 massive, heavily armed corporate security contractors immediately stepped out from the adjacent stairwell, aggressively cutting off my only possible avenue of escape. I was completely trapped deep underground, holding the loaded weapon that would destroy them all, and standing completely face to face with the monster who murdered my family. The air in the subterranean corridor suddenly felt thick enough to suffocate a man. Trent stood perfectly framed against the polished mahogany paneling of the elevator lobby, his custom Italian suit catching the dim, recessed lighting. The heavy oak door swung shut behind me, sealing me inside the small, carpeted space. Trent stood blocking my only exit, a look of amused disgust washing over his perfectly manicured features. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, inspecting the cheap charcoal suit hanging loosely off my bruised frame. He let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed violently off the polished marble walls. He did not see a grieving husband or a devastated father. He only saw a pathetic obstacle that had finally been cornered. Trent snapped his fingers, and two massive private security contractors immediately stepped out from the adjacent stairwell. They moved with military precision, completely blocking the hallway and crossing their thick arms over their dark tactical vests. Trent adjusted his silk tie entirely unbothered by my presence, treating the situation like a minor scheduling error on his flawless corporate itinerary. He looked me dead in the eyes and asked me what I was possibly doing scurrying around the basement of a commercial bank like a common street rat. He told me I was supposed to be hiding in some filthy gutter waiting for the police to inevitably drag me away in a canvas straitjacket. My older brother smiled, presenting a cold and terrifying expression completely devoid of human empathy. He openly gloated about the emergency psychiatric court order our father had secured the previous night. Trent leaned in close, his voice dripping with absolute arrogance, and told me that by tomorrow morning, my entire existence would be legally erased. He bragged that I would be heavily sedated, locked securely inside a padded white room, completely unable to cause any more public embarrassment for the Preston family name. He promised me that the local judge was firmly in their pocket, and no one in the world would ever listen to the desperate paranoid ramblings of a man officially diagnosed with a severe psychotic break. He told me I was going to rot in that asylum until the end of my natural life, completely forgotten by civilized society. I stood perfectly still, letting his venomous words wash over me. I did not shrink back, and I did not cower. My absolute silence seemed to agitate him. Trent narrowed his dark eyes, his gaze slowly dropping from my bruised face down to the heavy manila envelopes clutched tightly under my arm. The thick legal documents were visibly protruding from the side pocket of my cheap thrift store jacket. His cruel smile faded slightly, replaced by a sudden sharp curiosity. He demanded to know exactly what I had stolen from the safety deposit vault. Trent did not wait for my response. He lunged forward with sudden aggressive physical force, completely abandoning his polished corporate persona. He grabbed the lapels of my cheap suit, shoving me roughly against the solid oak door. The sudden impact sent a blinding flash of white-hot pain radiating directly through my cracked ribs. I gasped for air, but I did not fight back. I let my arms hang completely loose at my sides as Trent aggressively ripped the heavy manila envelopes directly out of my pocket. He stepped back, a triumphant sneer, returning rapidly to his face, fully believing he had just physically stripped me of my final desperate lifeline. He aggressively ripped open the top envelope, pulling out the thick stack of crisp white legal paper. I watched his eyes scan the top of the document. I watched the exact moment his arrogant, unshakable confidence completely shattered. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly, pale gray. His hands began to tremble violently as he read the bold, undeniable legal heading. He was staring directly at a fully notarized, sworn federal affidavit detailing the exact mechanics of his massive corporate Ponzi scheme and the specific transit bribes that led to the murder of my family. Trent looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute terror. His breathing became rapid and shallow. He screamed at me, demanding to know where I obtained these classified documents. He frantically flipped to the final page, seeing the official signature of his own former lead accountant, a man he thought he had successfully intimidated into total silence years ago. He realized in a fraction of a second that his entire criminal empire was completely exposed in plain, permanent ink. He yelled at the two security guards to lock the elevator and secure the perimeter, frantically declaring that I was never going to leave this basement alive. He told me I was a complete pathetic fool. Trent waved the physical papers directly in my face, laughing with a hysterical, desperate edge to his voice. He claimed that taking these affidavits from me was the absolute easiest victory of his life. He mocked me loudly, stating that without this physical proof, I was nothing but a crazy man with wild, unsubstantiated theories. He promised to shred these documents into absolute dust before the stock market bell even rang, ensuring his $500 million public offering would proceed flawlessly. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed physical force could solve his catastrophic structural problem. He did not realize that the papers in his shaking hands were completely worthless on their own. They were merely the ignition sequence. I looked at my older brother, the man who had casually traded the lives of my beautiful wife and my sweet young son for a temporary bump in his profit margins. I felt an incredible supernatural sense of calm wash completely over me. The sharp physical pain in my ribs faded into absolute nothingness. The inherent fear that had dictated my entire quiet life as an actuary simply ceased to exist. I reached slowly and deliberately into my interior breast pocket. Trent tensed, fully expecting me to pull out a lethal weapon. Instead, I simply pulled out the cheap, prepaid burner cellular phone I had purchased earlier that freezing morning. Trent stared at the small black device, thoroughly confused by my complete lack of physical resistance. I ignored him entirely. I focused my eyes purely on the bright, glowing screen of the device. I quickly navigated to the internal device settings and connected the phone directly to the open public wireless internet network currently provided for the massive press event happening in the lobby just 50 feet above our heads. The network icon flashed a solid, brilliant green. I was fully online. I opened the secure digital application I had loaded from Sarah's heavy titanium storage drive. The sleek, aggressive interface of her dead man's switch immediately appeared on the small screen. The program was currently locked, featuring a blinking cursor demanding the final authentication protocol. The required sequence was printed directly on the bottom corner of the first affidavit Trent was currently clutching in his sweaty, trembling hands. But I did not need to physically look at the document. I am an actuary. My entire professional life is built entirely on recalling complex sequences of numbers and recognizing intricate data patterns. I had flawlessly memorized the exact 12-digit alphanumeric code the very second I pulled the paperwork out of the subterranean steel box. I kept my eyes locked on the digital touch keyboard. My thumbs moved with rapid, flawless precision. I typed the first 4 letters, officially verifying the local offshore account registry. I typed the next 4 numbers, completely authenticating the corporate shell company tracking matrix. I typed the final 4 characters, explicitly unlocking the massive federal distribution protocol. Trent finally realized exactly what I was doing. The hysterical false confidence completely vanished from his voice, instantly replaced by a raw, guttural panic. He screamed at the private security guards at the top of his lungs, ordering them to seize the phone. The 2 massive mercenaries immediately lunged forward, closing the narrow gap between us in heavy armored strides. They reached out with thick, violent hands, preparing to tackle me to the carpeted floor and rip the digital device away. They were exactly 2 seconds too late. I thought of Sarah sitting terrified in her car, desperately building a digital fortress to protect our family from the very monsters who shared my last name. I thought of Leo holding his dirty brown stuffed bear, completely unaware that his own grandfather had priced his innocent life at the exact cost of replacement brake pads. I thought of the empty, muddy graves filling with water in the freezing Chicago rain. I pressed my thumb firmly against the bright red execution button located in the center of the screen. I hit send. A soft, simple, digital chime echoed loudly in the quiet elevator lobby. The screen instantly flashed a brilliant solid green. A progress bar zipped rapidly from 0 to 100% in a fraction of a single heartbeat. The message displayed a simple, beautiful word: delivered. In that exact fleeting microsecond, a massive encrypted digital payload was aggressively fired through the local wireless network. Thousands of pages of irrefutable forensic evidence, offshore bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and the unredacted truth about the deadly highway crash were simultaneously blasted to the senior directors of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Domestic Corruption Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and the investigative desks of the top 10 national media conglomerates in the country. The digital nuclear bomb had officially detonated. There was no corporate firewall, no expensive defense lawyer, and no corrupt local judge on earth who could possibly recall the data. The two security guards aggressively grabbed my shoulders violently, shoving me back against the mahogany wall, but I did not resist them in any capacity. I simply let my arms fall, completely limp at my sides. They roughly patted me down physically, searching for a traditional weapon, entirely failing to comprehend the absolute staggering magnitude of what had just occurred in the digital realm. Trent stared at me, his chest heaving rapidly, his pale face covered in a cold, terrified sweat. He looked at the small burner phone in my hand, desperately trying to mentally process the catastrophic situation. He asked me, his voice trembling and incredibly weak, what I had just done. I looked my older brother dead in the eyes. I looked past the expensive Italian suit, the arrogant societal entitlement, and the limitless corporate wealth. I saw a hollow, pathetic, terrified man who was about to lose absolutely everything he had ever cared about in his entire miserable existence. I did not scream. I did not gloat. I delivered the final crushing blow with the cold, measured precision of a man who had successfully mathematically calculated the absolute end of an empire. Check the news. I slowly opened my fingers. The cheap black burner phone slipped freely from my grasp, falling through the quiet air and hitting the carpeted floor landing directly at Trent's polished leather shoes. I gently shrugged off the heavy hands of the two security guards. They were highly trained tactical mercenaries, but they were also incredibly cautious legal contractors. I was not exhibiting any violent behavior. I was not physically resisting, and I was not attempting to steal any corporate property. They looked back at Trent for a direct physical command, completely confused by my sudden peaceful and compliant demeanor. But Trent could not speak. He could not issue a single coherent order. He was staring down at the discarded phone with absolute paralyzing horror, completely frozen by the undeniable reality of his impending destruction. He did not ask the guards to hold me. He did not move a single muscle in his body. I calmly adjusted the collar of my cheap thrift store suit. I completely ignored the two massive men standing on either side of me. I stepped forward, walking directly past my older brother, my shoulder brushing lightly against his frozen arm. I confidently pressed the call button for the main lobby elevator. The polished steel doors opened immediately. I stepped inside the empty car, turned around, and looked at Trent one final time as the heavy doors slowly slid shut, leaving him standing entirely alone in the basement with a fistful of worthless paper and a fraudulent empire rapidly crumbling into absolute dust. I stepped out of the heavy brass doors of First Republic Bank and back into the freezing, damp air of the Chicago morning. The brutal torrential storm from the previous night had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a dense gray fog that clung tightly to the towering steel skyscrapers. I walked exactly 1 block down the bustling commercial avenue and purchased a cheap black coffee from a corner street vendor. I found a small concrete bench directly across the street from the Grand Banking Plaza and sat down. I wrapped my freezing hands around the warm paper cup and waited. The massive public relations spectacle was reaching its absolute peak. Enormous digital screens erected outside the bank flashed a live, synchronized video feed straight from the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange. Trent and my father had spared absolutely no financial expense to ensure their victory was broadcast to the entire corporate world. A dense crowd of wealthy investors, local politicians, and hungry journalists clustered around the velvet ropes holding complimentary crystal flutes of imported champagne. The digital countdown clock on the giant monitors ticked mercilessly down to the opening bell. It was exactly 9:25 in the morning. My older brother was exactly 5 minutes away from achieving his ultimate lifelong dream of becoming a publicly traded billionaire. He was 5 minutes away from total untouchable supremacy. But I knew something the cheering crowd did not. I knew the exact velocity of the digital payload I had just unleashed from the basement vault. As a trained corporate actuary, I understood that catastrophic systemic failure never happens slowly. It happens all at once. When the structural integrity of a corrupt system is finally compromised, the resulting collapse is instantaneous and absolutely devastating. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bitter coffee, watching the giant red digital numbers tick down to 0. I thought about the beautiful forensic trap my wife had built, and I felt a profound sense of pride. The opening bell rang loudly through the massive outdoor speakers, signaling the official start of the global trading day. The crowd of elite socialites and greedy investors erupted into a massive round of enthusiastic applause. Trent stepped out onto the elevated marble portico, flanked immediately by my father and a dozen prominent city officials. Trent raised both of his arms in a triumphant, arrogant gesture, soaking in the absolute adoration of the financial elite. The giant digital screens flashed the newly minted stock ticker symbol for Preston Development. And then, precisely 40 seconds after the initial launch, the massive digital screens violently glitched. The brilliant green numbers tracking the rising stock price completely froze. A stark, glaring red banner flashed across every single monitor in the plaza. The bold white text explicitly announced an immediate emergency halt on all public trading for Preston Development. The enthusiastic applause outside the bank instantly faltered. The cheerful, lively atmosphere turned completely rigid with sudden mass confusion. I watched intently as dozens of cell phones in the crowd began ringing simultaneously. The sharp, chaotic sound of hundreds of notification alerts pierced through the cold morning fog. The journalists standing behind the velvet rope suddenly lowered their expensive cameras and stared wildly at their mobile screens. Sarah's incredibly meticulous forensic ledger had officially landed right on the desks of every major federal prosecutor and investigative reporter in the nation. The physical affidavits I had authenticated were entirely undeniable. The detailed offshore banking records, the blatant bribery logs, and the exact insurance waivers that directly killed my family were now completely public global knowledge. I watched my father, Richard, pull a vibrating silver phone from his custom suit jacket. I saw the exact horrifying second he read the breaking news alert from a major media outlet. His perfect, confident posture instantly collapsed. His shoulders violently slumped and his face drained of all human color, turning a sickening shade of pale gray. He looked frantically at Trent. My older brother was already staring wildly at his own device, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The illusion of their absolute power was shattering in real time right in front of a live national audience. The distant, high-pitched wailing of emergency sirens began to cut sharply through the heavy city fog. It was not just one or two isolated police vehicles. It was a massive, overwhelming chorus of aggressive sirens multiplying rapidly and echoing violently off the sheer glass canyons of the financial district. A sprawling convoy of heavy unmarked black sport utility vehicles aggressively turned the corner and swarmed the banking plaza. They completely ignored the designated traffic lanes, driving their heavy armored tires directly over the pristine, manicured sidewalks and tearing through the expensive floral arrangements. The vehicles slammed abruptly into park, forming a tight, impenetrable tactical perimeter around the entire building. Dozens of federal agents wearing thick, dark body armor emblazoned with bright yellow federal lettering poured out of the vehicles. They moved with terrifying, coordinated military precision. They did not care about the wealthy politicians or the elite country club members scattering in absolute panic. The federal agents aggressively shoved the stunned local police officers and private corporate mercenaries aside, entirely taking over the jurisdiction in a matter of seconds. I remained perfectly still on my cold concrete bench, drinking my coffee and watching the incredible, beautiful chaos unfold. The federal agents breached the grand glass doors of the bank, completely ignoring Trent's highly paid security detail. Less than 5 minutes later, they marched back out onto the marble portico. Trent was forcefully dragged through the revolving doors by two massive federal operatives. His expensive custom-tailored Italian jacket was torn and severely rumpled. His hands were bound tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The golden child of the Preston family, the man who believed he was an untouchable king, was currently weeping openly and hysterically in front of a dozen flashing news cameras. He was desperately shouting for his high-priced lawyers, begging the federal agents to listen to him screaming that it was all a massive misunderstanding. The agents completely ignored his pathetic, desperate cries, shoving him violently into the back of a dark armored transport vehicle. My father attempted to discreetly slip away through the chaotic, terrified crowd of fleeing investors. He was immediately flanked by three armed federal prosecutors. They backed the ruthless billionaire forcefully against a cold stone pillar, slapping the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists, while simultaneously reading him his constitutional rights. Richard looked absolutely broken, a hollow, empty shell of the terrifying monster who had commanded my entire life. The total obliteration of their empire was an absolute mathematical masterpiece. As I sat there watching the flashing red and blue emergency lights reflect off the wet pavement, I mentally calculated the exact speed of their destruction. Because Sarah had meticulously documented the interstate wire fraud and the massive criminal bribery syndicate, the federal government immediately invoked the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations statutes. The federal laws allowed the Department of Justice to instantly freeze every single financial asset globally connected to the Preston name. They did not just seize the corporate holding accounts, they aggressively targeted everything the family owned. I knew exactly what was happening on the other side of town at that very moment. My mother, Patricia, was likely sitting in the opulent dining room of her elite country club, enjoying a lavish, expensive breakfast and waiting for her wealthy friends to congratulate her on the public offering. I pictured the exact moment her platinum credit cards were instantly forcefully declined by the banking terminal. I imagined the profound, humiliating shock washing over her perfectly lifted face as the federal authorities locked down her personal checking accounts, her offshore trust funds, and her multi-million-dollar investment portfolios. She was instantly transformed from the most powerful, wealthy, manipulative socialite in Chicago into an absolute penniless pariah. Trent and Richard had spent their entire lives aggressively stealing from the innocent, destroying honest families, and measuring their human worth by the size of their bank accounts. They worshipped money and image above their own blood. Now the federal government had permanently stripped them of every single dollar they had ever touched. The sprawling $50 million luxury condominium tower was officially a seized federal crime scene. The luxury sports cars were heavily targeted for government repossession. The grand prestigious Preston legacy was completely annihilated in exactly 45 minutes. I stood up from the cold concrete bench and tossed my empty paper coffee cup into a nearby trash bin. I did not feel any grand, overwhelming sense of triumphant joy. I only felt a deep, heavy, profound sense of absolute completion. I had successfully executed my brilliant wife's final beautiful design. I had secured the justice my innocent son deeply deserved. I turned my back on the chaotic, swarming crime scene and walked away from my former family forever. I spent the entire day walking aimlessly through the quiet residential neighborhoods of the city, simply breathing the cold, clean air. When the sun finally set, I took a long, slow bus ride back to the miserable, decaying industrial sector on the extreme edge of town. I returned to my cheap, roach-infested $40 motel room. The air still smelled heavily of cheap pine disinfectant and old stale smoke, but I truly did not care. I took off my damp, cheap suit jacket and laid it over the single wooden chair. I reached into the plastic grocery bag and pulled out Leo's muddy, torn, stuffed bear. I placed the small brown toy gently on the scratched nightstand right next to the bed. I laid down on the sagging, stained mattress and closed my tired eyes. For the very first time since the devastating highway patrol officer knocked on my front door 5 days ago, my mind was completely, totally silent. The crushing, suffocating grief had finally softened into a quiet, gentle ache. I knew I still had a long, difficult road ahead to rebuild my life from absolute zero, but the terrifying monsters were permanently locked away. I pulled the thin, faded floral bedspread over my shoulders and finally fell into a deep, heavy, dreamless sleep. Hours later, the dark, silent room was violently shattered. I jerked awake in the pitch black, my heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against my bruised healing ribs. The glowing red numbers on the cheap digital alarm clock read exactly 3 a.m. Outside the thin motel window, the freezing Chicago rain was pouring down in a massive, violent deluge once again. Someone was aggressively pounding on my flimsy wooden motel door. It was not a polite, casual knock. It was a frantic, desperate, completely terrified hammering that rattled the cheap metal deadbolt loudly in its housing. A muffled, pathetic voice cried out over the howling wind, frantically begging and pleading for me to open the door. The relentless pounding threatened to completely splinter the cheap wooden frame of my motel room door. I sat up quickly on the sagging mattress, my heart instantly hammering a frantic warning rhythm against my bruised and healing ribs. The glowing red digital numbers on the cheap alarm clock resting on the nightstand read exactly 3 a.m. Outside the single thin window pane, the violent Chicago winter storm was still raging, dumping massive heavy sheets of freezing water against the glass. Whoever was standing on the other side of that locked door in the middle of a torrential downpour was completely desperate. I stood up and walked slowly across the heavily stained carpet. I did not feel any sudden panic. I did not feel any lingering anxiety. When you have already endured the absolute worst tragedy imaginable and successfully burned a corrupt empire to the ground, a loud noise in the dark holds absolutely no power over your mind. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and turned the rusted brass deadbolt. I pulled the heavy wooden door wide open, letting the bitter, freezing winter wind rush violently into the small, confined room. Standing right in front of me on the flooded concrete exterior walkway were my mother and my father. The sheer visual contrast from just a few short hours ago was absolutely staggering. Yesterday afternoon, Richard and Patricia Preston were practically American royalty. They had stood proudly in a $50 million polished marble lobby, radiating untouchable corporate wealth and supreme social arrogance. Now they looked exactly like terrified hollow ghosts. The torrential freezing rain had completely ruined Patricia's meticulously styled hair, leaving it plastered in wet, chaotic strands against her pale face. Her incredibly expensive designer evening gown was soaked straight through, clinging awkwardly to her frail, violently shaking frame. Her flawless cosmetic makeup was completely washed away by the storm, revealing the deep, severe aging lines of an exhausted woman who had just watched her entire fake artificial reality permanently evaporate. Richard stood closely beside her, leaning his heavy shoulders desperately against the exterior brick wall of the motel for basic physical support. His custom-tailored, expensive Italian tuxedo was utterly destroyed, plastered with dark, filthy street mud and soaking wet. The federal law enforcement authorities had obviously moved with terrifying aggressive speed following the digital data release. Richard looked up at me with wide, panicked, bloodshot eyes. He was shivering so violently from the cold and the shock that he could barely form a coherent physical sentence. His voice shook heavily over the loud, howling wind as he told me the devastating news. He explained that Trent had been completely and totally denied bail by the federal magistrate. The federal judge had officially deemed my older brother a massive international flight risk due to the extensive offshore banking documents I had successfully exposed to the national media. Trent was currently sitting completely alone in a freezing concrete federal holding cell, wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his luxury sports cars, his tailored suits, and his massive inflated ego. The golden child of the Preston family, the untouchable real estate king, was going directly to a federal penitentiary, and my parents had absolutely zero resources left to save his life. Richard choked on his own words as he admitted the absolute depth of their current ruin. He told me the Department of Justice had permanently legally frozen every single bank account, every hidden international trust fund, and every single line of corporate credit permanently tied to our family name under strict federal racketeering statutes. They were instantly penniless. They could not even afford to hire a basic defense attorney, let alone the elite corporate legal team they desperately required. Suddenly, Patricia collapsed violently forward. The wealthiest, most manipulative elite socialite in the entire city fell directly to her knees in the freezing, dirty, muddy puddles accumulating on the concrete walkway. She reached out with wet, trembling hands and grabbed the fabric of my cheap gray thrift store trousers. She began sobbing uncontrollably into the cold night air. It was not the fake, highly theatrical crying she had expertly utilized at the exclusive country club just a few hours ago to successfully convince the local politicians that I was a dangerous, unstable lunatic. This was raw, unfiltered, agonizing human panic. She begged me to save them from total destruction. She pleaded with me, looking up from the mud, to immediately call the federal prosecutors and officially claim that I had completely fabricated the entire digital forensic ledger. She desperately wanted me to swear under federal oath that the corrupt lawyer Harrison Cole had viciously manipulated my immense, overwhelming grief and physically forced me to upload fraudulent banking documents. She actually looked up at me with freezing rain running down her face and aggressively asked me to sacrifice my own permanent freedom to rescue the very same monsters who had joyfully orchestrated my absolute ruin. Richard stepped quickly forward, pushing his weeping, terrified wife slightly aside. His immense corporate pride was entirely permanently broken, but his deeply toxic transactional mindset remained completely intact. He still desperately believed that every single human being on Earth had a specific, actionable purchase price. He raised his wet hands in a frantic, submissive gesture and offered me the entire world. He frantically promised that if I publicly retracted my federal whistleblower submission, he would immediately formally step down from the development company. He swore on his life he would legally name me the sole, absolute chief executive officer of the Preston real estate empire. He frantically and quickly claimed he had millions of dollars buried in secret, unregulated international cryptocurrency accounts that the federal government analysts had not yet successfully discovered. He offered to illegally transfer every single hidden digital penny directly into my personal possession. He begged me, with tears welling in his own dark eyes, to simply take the hidden money, take the absolute corporate power, and please just let his favorite older son walk away free. I stood perfectly still in the motel doorway, allowing the freezing rain to wash completely over my face. I looked down at the two miserable, shivering creatures kneeling in the filthy street mud. I searched deep inside my own soul, and I felt absolutely no pity for their suffering. I felt no lingering sense of biological familial obligation. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound, and heavy disgust. I looked directly into my father's desperate, terrified eyes and asked him if he clearly remembered what he was doing exactly 5 days ago. I kept my voice completely flat, steady, and totally devoid of any sympathetic emotional warmth. I explicitly reminded them both that while they were busy smiling happily for the national media cameras and actively cutting a giant red silk ribbon with novelty golden scissors, I was standing completely alone over a freshly dug dark hole in the frozen ground. I told them that I manually lowered my brilliant, beautiful wife and my innocent, sweet 7-year-old boy into the freezing mud, completely by myself, without a single comforting hand on my shoulder. They had actively ignored my desperate phone calls. They had entirely dismissed my horrific, catastrophic tragedy as a minor, annoying social inconvenience. They had deliberately prioritized a shallow corporate public relations event over the solemn burial of their own literal flesh and blood. I looked down at Patricia, who was still weakly clutching the wet hem of my pant leg. I asked her directly if she had even bothered to learn the specific name of the public cemetery where her only biological grandson was currently permanently sleeping. She physically violently recoiled, dropping her hands instantly and staring down at the flooded concrete in absolute total crushing shame. She did not speak a single word because she simply did not know the answer. I turned my cold attention back to Richard. I systematically and verbally dismantled his pathetic final financial bribe. I told him his deeply hidden, stolen money was completely, totally worthless to my existence. I explicitly explained that I never once wanted to be a ruthless corporate chief executive officer, and I never held any secret desire to live inside a sterile $50 million glass penthouse. I told him I had already possessed everything I ever genuinely wanted in this entire difficult world. I had a warm, modest, quiet home, deeply filled with continuous laughter. I had a brilliant wife who looked at me with absolute profound respect and unconditional love. I had a beautiful son who truly thought I was a massive hero, simply because I patiently helped him build complex plastic toy castles on our living room floor every single Sunday afternoon. I raised my voice slightly, letting the cold, unyielding truth echo loudly over the intense Chicago storm. I told my father that his absolute, blind, violent obsession with endless corporate expansion had poisoned his human mind so deeply that he willingly, intentionally traded those beautiful, innocent lives for cheap replacement commercial brake pads. He had directly murdered his own loving family members just to legally protect a temporary quarterly profit margin and artificially inflate a corrupt stock price. I took one slow, deliberate physical step backward out of the freezing rain and into the dry, quiet safety of my temporary motel room. I looked down at them, shivering uncontrollably in the dark, violent storm, and delivered my absolute final words to the people who brought me into this world. I told them they never understood the fundamental concept of true human wealth. They had spent their entire miserable, pathetic lives aggressively chasing a hollow, fake, superficial reflection of power. You chose your image over your own blood. Now you have neither. I reached out and firmly grasped the cold brass edge of the cheap wooden motel door. Patricia screamed my name, a ragged, terrifying, desperate sound that was instantly swallowed whole by the howling winter wind. Richard lunged forward frantically, reaching a muddy, shaking hand toward the wooden doorframe to stop me. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I slammed the heavy wooden door forcefully and violently shut directly in their horrified faces. The sharp, violent mechanical sound of the heavy brass deadbolt sliding securely into its metal housing echoed loudly and definitively through the small, quiet room. The physical wooden barrier was absolutely permanent. The corrupt Preston family was completely, totally dead to me. I turned my back away from the locked door and walked slowly across the stained carpet, returning to the edge of the sagging mattress. The frantic, desperate pounding on the exterior wood resumed almost immediately, echoing weakly and pathetically against the cheap structure, but I completely, entirely ignored it. Their panicking, pathetic cries were absolutely nothing more than meaningless, distant background noise. I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed and reached out with my bruised, healing hands. I picked up the small, muddy, torn stuffed bear resting quietly on the cheap wooden nightstand. I held Barnaby gently and securely in my lap, carefully tracing the soft, heavily worn brown fabric with my thumb. The intense, raging winter storm howling aggressively outside my window felt entirely, completely disconnected from the profound, deep, absolute peace finally settling warmly into my chest. The brutal, exhausting war was officially and permanently over. My beautiful Sarah and my sweet, innocent Leo finally had their absolute, unyielding justice. As the heavy, relentless rain continued to wash the filthy city streets completely clean, I sat in the dark silence and realized a profound, essential, fundamental truth about the human existence. True, ultimate, indestructible power does not ever come from massive offshore investment portfolios, luxury real estate developments, or elite, corrupt political connections. True, genuine power is the absolute, liberating freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose in this world, and courageously, boldly choosing to stand perfectly aligned with the undeniable truth. My corrupt family had illegally possessed all the stolen money in the entire world, but they were ultimately terrified. Fragile, pathetic cowards, aggressively hiding behind expensive tailored suits and cowardly forged signatures. They arrogantly believed they could easily instantly crush a quiet, modest actuary, because they severely and fatally mistook my gentle, peaceful nature for absolute weakness. They learned the hardest, most devastating human lesson absolutely possible. When you selfishly, violently take away everything a good man deeply loves, you leave him with absolutely no logical reason to ever hold back his righteous fury. If you're listening to my story right now, I need you to completely stop and deeply remember one crucial, essential thing today. Look very closely at the faces of the people sitting around your simple dinner table tonight. Cherish their loud, chaotic laughter deeply. Value their quiet, steady presence and fiercely protect them with absolutely everything you have inside your soul. The absolute greatest, most valuable treasure you will ever possibly possess in this unpredictable life is the unconditional love of your family, and absolutely no amount of corporate wealth or social prestige can ever successfully replace an empty, silent chair. Thank you for quietly listening to my difficult story. If this deeply personal message resonated with your own life, please hit the like button and actively share this video with someone who desperately needs a strong reminder about what truly fundamentally matters in this world. Drop a comment below and tell me about a specific time you bravely had to stand up for the absolute truth against completely impossible, overwhelming odds. Make sure to absolutely subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories about finding pure justice, building unbreakable resilience, and discovering the incredible, unstoppable power of the human spirit.